The wind on Raven Mesa had a voice. It didn't whisper. It scoured. It was the first thing Coulter Vale heard every morning and the last thing he heard at night. A high, lonesome howl that rattled the single pane of glass in his cabin window and worried the loose shingle on the barn roof. This morning, it was early. The sky was a bruised purple, not yet committed to being day. The wind tasted of red dust, sharp and alkaline, flung up from the flats below. It whipped the tail of Coulter's worn canvas coat and set the iron bell at the gate of the Ash Willow Ranch to clanging a dull, irregular rhythm. The sound was too much like a summons, and Coulter had no patience for visitors. He stood by his horse, a stoic roan gelding named Silas. His hands, chapped and scarred from rope and weather, moved with an economy born of long habit, checking the cinch on his saddle. The leather was old, bleached pale by a decade of sun and sweat. The stitching frayed in half a dozen places. It was his wife's saddle. Really, he'd adjusted it for himself after she was gone. He didn't think about that. He just pulled the latigo strap one last time, the grunt forced from his chest as much by the cold as by the effort. He was a man who lived by subtraction. He'd buried Alara 3 years ago down in Juniper Wash, a place that had seemed peaceful until it wasn't. The official report said it was a rock slide, a freak accident while she was searching for stray calves. Coulter knew rock slides. He knew the way the earth split and fell. He also knew the tracks he'd found just uphill from the slide tracks of 2 shod horses, lingering where no horses had business being. But the tracks vanished on the high rock, and Sheriff Murdoch of Brimstone Creek had called it grief, said Coulter was seeing ghosts. So Coulter had subtracted. He'd subtracted the town, the saloon, the church, and every damned friendly face that looked at him with pity. He'd subtracted hope, mostly. He was down to just the ranch, the wind, and the work. And today, the work required a new horse. The rumor had come out of Kettlebone Station, carried by a freighter who'd stopped to water his mules. A prime piece of horseflesh, a white racing stud called Comet Jack, had been seized by Sheriff Murdoch himself, as evidence in some trumped-up gambling dispute at the Painted Butte track. Now, the horse was at the town impound in Brimstone Creek, and word was Murdoch wasn't waiting for any auction. He was selling the horse quiet-like, under the table, to whichever speculator had the deepest pockets and the fewest morals. Coulter spat the red dust from his mouth. He hated Brimstone Creek. He hated Murdoch. But Ash Willow was failing. He'd lost 3 good mares to mountain cats the previous winter, and his spring foals were thin. He needed new blood in his line, something fast and strong to build on. Comet Jack was that. He swung up onto Silas, the old leather groaning under his weight. He didn't look back at the dark cabin. He was going for a horse. Nothing more. He'd ride in, pay in cash. He'd scrape together $200, a damning fortune, get the bill of sale, and be back on Raven Mesa before the sun was high. No talk, no trouble, no entanglements with the messy, treacherous lives of other people. He'd learned his lesson at Juniper Wash. A man alone could be broken, but he couldn't be betrayed. Brimstone Creek sat in a crease of the world, smelling of sulfur from the nearby springs and the sour mash of the Coyote Ladder Saloon. By the time Coulter rode in, a low fog was curling up from the creek bed, mingling with the wood smoke and the ever-present dust. It wasn't yet 7 in the morning, but the town felt hungover. The impound ranch was a collection of rickety corrals and a long, low barn squatting behind the sheriff's office. It was a place for stolen goods and broken dreams. Coulter dismounted, looping Silas's reins over a hitching post that sagged to one side. The main gate was barred, but a smaller side gate stood ajar. He could hear a man singing, a slurred, tuneless noise that broke off into a cough. Coulter slipped through the gate. The fog was thick here, clinging to the ground and muffling his footsteps in the churned mud. A lantern hung from a post, casting a weak, greasy circle of light. In it, a man sat on an overturned bucket, a bottle dangling from his hand. This would be the stablemaster. a man named Jedediah Poole, known for preferring whiskey to water. Poole looked up, his eyes struggling to focus.
"We ain't open. Less you're the fella."
"I'm the fella," Coulter said, his voice flat. He kept his coat buttoned, his hands away from his sidearm. "Right," Poole muttered. He made an effort to stand, failed, and gave up. He gestured with the bottle toward the barn. "He's in there. End stall. Murdoch said you'd know the price. Cash, no paper."
"I'll see the horse first,"
Coulter said. "Suit yourself." Poole took another long pull from the bottle. "He's a devil, that one. Bit my hand clean to the bone." He held up his hand, wrapped in a filthy rag, as proof. Coulter nodded once and moved past him, into the cavernous darkness of the barn. The air inside was thick with the warm, animal smell of hay, manure, and horse, but underneath it, there was something else, the sharp tang of liniment and the coppery scent of fear. Fog curled in through the open doors, making ghosts of the shafts of pre-dawn light that pierced the gaps in the roof. Most of the stalls were empty. A few skeletal-looking cattle lowed miserably from a far pen. He walked the length of the aisle, his boots quiet on the packed earth. He passed the end stall, but it was empty. He frowned. Poole was drunk, but was he lying? He stopped, listened. At first, nothing. Just the wind worrying the roof and the shuffling of the cattle. Then, from the attached tack room at the very end of the barn, he heard it. It wasn't a sound a horse would make. It was a whisper, a human voice, low and steady, a woman's voice. "Easy now, easy. Jack, I know it hurts. Just hold still. They won't hit you again. Not while I'm here. Easy, boy." Coulter's hand instinctively went to the grip of his Colt. Every nerve ending screamed trap. He'd walked into a setup. Murdoch was playing him. He took a slow breath, eased the pistol from its holster, and moved toward the tack room door. It was open just a crack. He put his shoulder to the wood and pushed. The door swung inward with a long, agonizing scrape. The room was dark, lit only by a single, grime-caked lantern turned down low. It was packed with saddles, bridles, and feed sacks. And in the center, towering over everything, was the horse. He was magnificent, a true white, not a gray, with the deep chest and powerful hindquarters of a sprinter. Even standing in the gloom, he vibrated with contained energy. But he was hurt. His head was low, his left foreleg cocked at an angle, and his white coat was streaked with dirt and something dark. And the voice was right, standing on a small stool, her body pressed against the horse's neck, was a young woman. She was small, drowned in a man's shirt that was torn at the shoulder. Her hair, the color of wet straw, was matted with bits of hay. Her face was smudged with dirt, but it couldn't hide the sharp line of her jaw or the fierce, desperate clarity of her eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, and right now, they were fixed on Coulter. She had one arm wrapped around the stallion's massive neck, the other hand holding a damp rag to a gash on his shoulder. The horse tossed his head, his eyes rolling white, and let out a percussive snort. "Don't hit him again," she said, her voice shaking but not breaking. It was the same voice from the whisper, but now it was an accusation. Coulter kept the pistol pointed at the floor, his thumb on the hammer. "I'm not here to hit him. Ma'am, I'm here to buy him." Her gaze swept over him, taking in his worn boots, his rancher's coat, the cold practicality in his face. The tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction, but the defiance didn't. "You can't. He's not for sale. Not by them. He's evidence, seized by the sheriff." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "He's evidence, the same way a stacked deck's luck. I'm Lark Monroe. I was the head breaker at Painted Butte before this." She gestured to her torn shirt. "To the dark room. I got into debt at the Coyote Ladder Saloon, a debt I didn't rightly earn, But Ivory Nell, she runs the place, said I owed it, said I'd work it off. Coulter knew what working it off meant for a woman at the Coyote Ladder. His stomach tightened. But I don't pour whiskey, Lark continued, her voice hardening. I train horses, so they put me on debt servitude to Murdoch, mucking his stalls, tending his seizures. They thought I was just some dumb stable girl. They didn't know I'd raised Comet Jack from a foal. She stroked the horse's neck, her touch infinitely gentle. I didn't run, not until I found the book. Murdoch and his real boss, Barlow Fitch. They ain't just selling a horse. They're running a whole straw bale scheme. They bring in stolen thoroughbreds, swap their pedigrees with cheap ranch stock, and sell 'em back east for 10 times their worth. This horse, she patted his neck, is the proof. His real papers are hidden. They were going to lose him tonight, sell him to you, probably. And by the time you figured out he wasn't the horse on the paper, they'd be gone, and Murdoch would arrest you for theft. A heavy, drunken footstep slammed into the barn aisle outside. Who's in there? Who you talking to, girl? Lark's eyes flew wide with panic. In one fluid motion, she slid off the stool, grabbed Coulter's arm with a grip like steel, and pulled him bodily behind the massive stallion. She put her finger to her lips, a silent, desperate shh, and then grabbed Comet Jack's halter. Just talking to the horse, Mr. Poole, she called out, her voice suddenly light, servile. He's just spooked by the fog. She led the horse in a tight circle, using his body as a shield, blocking the doorway. Coulter was pinned between the warm, trembling flank of the animal and a wall of feed sacks. He could smell the horse, the straw, and the faint, clean scent of lye soap that clung to the girl. If you're here for the horse, she whispered, her back to the door, her voice barely a breath. Be still. He doesn't belong to them. And he's hurt. Jed Poole's shadow fell across the doorway. Get out of the way, girl. The buyer's here. He's... Poole squinted into the dark. Where is that fella? Coulter used the moment. He was a rancher. He knew livestock. He didn't need daylight to see the truth. His eyes, adjusted to the gloom, scanned the horse. Lark was right. There were fresh welts, thin and sharp, high on the hindquarters. A poor quality ownership document was tacked to the wall, the ink smeared, the signature a forgery, and the gash on the shoulder. It wasn't just a gash. Coulter leaned closer. The air was thick with the cloying smell of pine tar. A trick, a common, dirty trick to cover a wound, or worse, a brand. They'd covered the dried blood. He looked at Lark. She saw him see it, and she nodded once. I said, "Move, girl," Poole roared. He lurched into the room, his patience gone. He wasn't holding a bottle now. He was holding a coiled rope, thick and heavy. He raised it, not at the horse, but at Lark. "You've been nothing but trouble." A length of rope uncoiled like a striking snake. Coulter didn't have time to think. He didn't think about Juniper Wash. He didn't think about entanglements or staying clear. He just moved. He lunged forward, shoving Lark out of the way. He took the blow himself. The wet, heavy rope slammed across his shoulder and chest, stinging like fire even through his thick coat. The force of it, combined with his own momentum, sent him staggering back. He collided with Lark. Both of them went down. They landed in a deep pile of clean straw, a soft explosion of dust and dry stems. He landed half on top of her, his body shielding hers from the fall, his arm thrown wide to break the impact. The world stopped. There was no sound but the frantic huffing of the horse, the sudden, shocked silence from Poole, and the ragged gasp of the woman beneath him. He was pressed against her, his chest to her back. He could feel the sharp, frail bones of her shoulder blades, the frantic hammering of her heart against his ribs. Or maybe it was his own. The air was thick with the scent of hay and the smell of her hair. And for a half second, the only thing that existed in the world was the solid, warm, trembling life beneath him. Their eyes met. He turned his head as he fell, and she was looking back over her shoulder. Her eyes weren't just defiant now. They were terrified, and in that terror, he saw a mirror of the same thing he'd felt 3 years ago, the horrifying realization that the world was not just hard, but actively, malevolently cruel. The moment was taut as a fresh-strung bowstring. "Hey, get the sheriff!" Poole bellowed, breaking the spell. He scrambled back into the aisle. "We got thieves! Get Murdoch! They're stealing the horse!" Footsteps pounded on the hard-packed earth outside. Shouts echoed. Lark struggled, trying to get out from under him. "We have to go! They'll kill him! They'll kill us!" Coulter rolled off her, getting to his feet in one smooth, practiced motion. He grabbed her arm and pulled her up. The rope had left a dark, wet line across his coat. He looked at the horse. He looked at the girl. He looked at the open doorway, where shadows were already gathering. He'd come to Brimstone Creek for one thing. He'd come to avoid the very trouble that was now breathing down his neck. He'd sworn off it. He leaned in close, his voice a low, urgent rasp against her ear. "I came for a horse," Coulter Vale whispered. "But I might be leaving with one more person." The shouts, "Thieves get Murdoch," echoed in the cavernous barn, sharp and sudden as a gunshot. Jed Poole, scrambling back, raised the alarm, his voice cracking with whiskey and panic. In the tack room, Comet Jack screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound, and reared against the wall. Lark flinched, her hand flying to the horse's neck to calm him, her eyes wide and trapped. This was it, the moment Coulter Vale had spent 3 years avoiding, the flashpoint where a simple transaction turned into a blood feud. His gut screamed at him to pull his gun, grab the girl, and blast his way out. But that was the path to Juniper Wash. That was the path to another grave. He holstered his pistol. He stepped out of the tack room and into the main aisle. Pulling the door shut behind him, he moved with deliberate calm, his hands raised, palms open and empty. He walked straight toward the main barn doors, where the shapes of men were now gathering against the foggy morning light.
Hold your fire!
Coulter's voice boomed, cutting through the panic. It was a voice used to commanding cattle over the sound of a storm, and it stopped Poole in his tracks. Sheriff Murdoch pushed through the door, his hand already on his sidearm. He was a thick-bodied man, his face puffy and veined, his star pinned crookedly to a stained vest. Behind him, a taller, thinner man lingered. He was dressed in a clean black duster and a flat-brimmed hat, his face shadowed, his eyes as still and cold as river stones. This had to be Barlow Fitch. "Who in the hell are you?" Murdoch demanded, his pistol clearing the holster. "I'm your buyer," Coulter said evenly. He gestured with his chin toward Poole, who was nursing his rope. "This fool just tried to strike a paying customer. I came to see the horse. He spooked that girl." He nodded toward the tack room door. "Was just trying to calm him." Murdoch's eyes narrowed, shifting from Coulter to the tack room, then to Fitch. Fitch gave a barely perceptible nod.
"Poole, you idiot!"
Murdoch snarled, holstering his weapon. "This is the man. The one from Raven Mesa." He turned his attention back to Coulter, his suspicion replaced by a greasy appraisal. "So, you're Vale. Heard you were reclusive." "I'm here for the horse, Sheriff, not conversation," Coulter said. He pushed past them, back toward the tack room. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm not buying a pig in a poke, especially not one that's got your man here jumpy enough to start swinging rope." He'd seized control. He'd turned their trap into a negotiation. He could feel Lark's presence behind the door, a silent, terrified witness. He needed to keep Murdoch and Fitch focused on him. He opened the door. Comet Jack was still trembling, his white coat dark with sweat. Lark stood pressed against the wall, trying to make herself invisible. Coulter ignored her. He walked straight to the horse, his movements slow, professional. This was a language he knew. He ran a hand down the stallion's neck, speaking in a low, meaningless rumble. "Easy, son. Let's have a look at you." He was buying time. Time for Lark to do whatever it was she needed to do. He could feel Fitch's cold stare on his back, a prickle between his shoulder blades.
He's prime,
Murdoch offered, stepping into the doorway.
"Fastest thing on 4 legs this side of the divide."
Coulter grunted, his hand moving to the horse's mouth. He pressed his thumb into the corner of the jaw, forcing it open. "We'll see." He examined the teeth, his face a mask of neutral assessment.
"He's 5. He said maybe 6. Papers say 4.
"Papers are adjustable," Fitch said, his voice a dry rasp. He hadn't moved from the aisle. Coulter let the jaw snap shut. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Lark, seizing the opportunity of all eyes being on the horse, slipped like a shadow out of the tack room, disappearing into the dark recesses of the barn. Neither Fitch nor Murdoch noticed. They were watching the money. Coulter continued his performance. He ran his hands down the horse's legs, checking the tendons. "He's favoring that left foreleg."
"He just knocked it on the stall,"
Murdoch said quickly, too quickly. Coulter's fingers found the spot, high on the shoulder, just under the mane. It was a small, hard knot. He pressed it. The horse flinched violently, pulling away.
"Sore," Coulter said flatly.
"He's a stud. He's spirited," Fitch countered. "Spirited or drugged," Coulter said, not looking at them. He'd seen marks like this before. A needle, pushed in haste, leaving a telltale bruise. They'd been doping him, running him hard, likely in crooked races, and this seizure was just a way to launder him. He heard the 2 men mutter, their voices dropping low. They thought he was out of earshot, still focused on the horse.
"Get him on the midnight wagon to St. Louis,"
Fitch rasped.
"This rancher is a complication. Sell him the horse, get the cash, and we're clear."
"What about the girl?" Murdoch asked.
"She knows too much,"
Fitch replied, his voice devoid of any emotion.
"She'll be on that wagon, too. In the cargo hold, Nell wants her debt settled permanent."
A cold dread washed over Coulter. This wasn't just about a horse. It was about a woman's life. He thought of Juniper Wash, of the tracks on the ridge. He thought of a rock slide that wasn't a rock slide. He straightened up, brushing dust from his hands. He turned to face them, his expression hard. He's lame, he's drugged, and his papers are forged, but he's got the bloodline. "I'll give you $200, cash, right now." Murdoch's eyes lit up. It was more than he'd expected. "But," Coulter added, holding up one hand, "I want a clean bill of sale. Signed by you, Sheriff. I want clean papers. I'm not getting hauled in for buying stolen goods. You guarantee the title, and the money is yours." This was the gamble. He was forcing Murdoch's hand, making him put his own name to the fraud. It was a move born of desperation, a legal feint in a lawless place. Fitch and Murdoch exchanged a look. Fitch was weighing the risk against the reward. Coulter was offering them an easy out, a fool rancher, blinded by bloodlines, willing to pay top dollar. "You'll get your paper," Fitch said. "Murdoch, go to the office. Write him a bill of sale for 1 gray gelding. Pool. Watch our guest." Murdoch nodded.
"This way. Vale. We'll do this proper."
Coulter felt a new spike of panic. They were separating him from the barn. What about Lark? As he turned, he saw her. She was standing by a stack of hay bales 20 feet down the aisle, holding a wooden bucket as if she'd just been on a chore. She looked small, defeated, a part of the barn's grime. She walked past him, her eyes on the floor. As she passed the tack room door, where a half-dozen bridles hung, her hand, blackened with dirt, reached out. She tapped the brass buckle of a headstall twice. The signal. It meant she had it. The stud book. He'd seen her slip out, but where his mind raced, his saddlebags. She'd gone out the back, circled around to his horse. The proof was on Silas. But Poole had seen her, too. "Hey!" the stablemaster shouted, his fogged brain finally catching up. "That's the girl. What's she? She was outside by your horse. Mr. Lark dropped the bucket and sprinted for the main door. "Get her!" Fitch roared. The illusion of the sale vanished. A deputy, who had been lounging by the door, grabbed for Lark. Coulter moved. He didn't draw his gun. He grabbed the nearest weapon, a 50-pound sack of powdered lime, stacked by the stalls for sanitation. With a grunt, he heaved it. Not at the deputy, but at the ground right in front of him. The sack burst. A blinding white cloud erupted, filling the aisle. The deputy screamed as the caustic dust hit his eyes. Murdoch and Fitch staggered back, coughing, their hands over their faces. "This way!" Coulter yelled, grabbing Lark's arm. He didn't run for the main door. He ran for the side gate he'd entered through, dragging her with him. They burst out into the foggy morning, the shouts of "Stop them!" muffled behind them. Silas was 20 yards away, hitched to the sagging post. A shot rang out. Not a bullet, a shotgun blast. Coulter heard the hiss of it, a spray of rock salt that peppered the stable wall beside them. Murdoch was reloading, aiming lower this time. Coulter shoved Lark behind him, took 2 long strides, and unhitched Silas with one violent tug. He threw his heavy canvas coat at Lark. "Hold this, face me." He swung into the saddle, his coat held open like a shield. Another blast tore through the air. The rock salt hammered into the thick coat, stinging like 100 hornets, but it didn't break the canvas. Coulter grabbed Lark by the waist. She was light, all bone and adrenaline. He hauled her up, throwing her sideways across the saddle in front of him. "Break the gate!" she screamed. Coulter didn't hesitate. He wheeled Silas, a horse trained for the rough and tumble of herding, and spurred him hard. The roan gelding lowered his head and charged. They hit the flimsy side gate with a crash of splintering wood. The hinges tore free. Silas stumbled, recovered, and found his footing in the muddy alleyway. "Which way?" Coulter yelled, fighting for control as he hauled Lark upright, seating her securely in front of him. Left toward the ravine of glass. They thundered out of the alley and onto the main street, a chaotic vision of 1 horse and 2 riders, scattering chickens and a stray dog. Behind them, Murdoch, Fitch, and 2 deputies were mounted, their horses spilling out of the sheriff's yard in pursuit. The ravine of glass was a bad path, a gash in the earth filled with shards of black obsidian and flint. It was a horse killer. It was also the only way to the high country that wasn't a main road. "They'll follow!" Coulter shouted over the wind and the pounding hooves. "They have to!" Lark yelled back. "That book is their ruin!" Silas's hooves struck the flinty ground, sending up showers of sparks, a clatter like breaking plates. The horse was powerful, but he was carrying double, and the men behind them were gaining. A bullet whined past Coulter's ear, so close he felt its heat. "In your saddlebag," Lark twisted, her small hands digging into the leather pouch beside his leg. "The lantern. It's not lit. Doesn't need to be." She pulled it out, a standard tin and glass stable lantern, half full of oil. "Give me your matches." His mind was on the horse, on the treacherous path, but his hand found the small, waterproof tin in his vest pocket. He pressed it into her hand. She didn't try to light the wick. She fumbled a match free, struck it on the tin, and jammed the sputtering flame straight into the oil reservoir through the filler cap. The lantern erupted into a ball of flame. "Now!" she shrieked. Without looking back, she hurled the makeshift bomb onto the path behind them. It shattered on the obsidian. Burning oil splashed across the narrow trail, a sudden, bright orange wall of fire. The lead horse of their pursuers, Murdoch's big bay, reared in terror, screaming as the flames licked its legs. It crashed sideways into Fitch's horse. Coulter heard the sickening sound of men and horses falling on the hard rock, the curses lost in the inferno. They had bought themselves time. They didn't stop, pushing Silas for another 2 miles. up through the ravine and into the high chaparral, finally ducking into a dense stand of trees. Hidden within was a collapsed shape, the remains of an old granary from a forgotten homestead. Hollow Briar, the locals called it. Coulter slid from the saddle, his legs shaking from the strain. He reached up for Lark. She didn't take his hand. She threw her leg over and slid down, landing hard, her legs buckling. He caught her before she fell, his hands closing around her upper arms. She was trembling, not from the cold, but from sheer, bone-deep terror. They're gone," she stuttered, staring back the way they had come. "For now," Coulter said, his voice grim. He let go of her, and as she stepped back, his eyes caught something. Her torn shirt sleeve had fallen back. Her wrist was a geography of old pain. Dark, faded purple bruises, ringed with the raw, chafed skin of a shackle or a tight binding rope. She'd been cuffed, chained. She saw him looking and yanked the sleeve down, her face hardening. "I didn't need your help," she spat, her voice low and fierce. Coulter felt a cold anger rise, an anger he hadn't felt since Juniper Wash. "Is that so? You had it all under control back there? Did you, the rope?" The midnight wagon. "I had a plan." "Your plan was to get yourself killed," he shot back, his own adrenaline finally cracking his calm. "I came for a horse. Girl, a simple horse. I didn't come to start a war with the sheriff." "You think this wasn't already a war?" she cried, stepping toward him, her small frame radiating fury. "You just chose to ignore it." She jabbed a finger at his chest. "I don't need a savior, Mr. Vale. I don't need another man telling me he knows best, right before he walks away." "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, turning away to check Silas, his hands suddenly unsteady. "Don't you?" Her voice was sharp. "I just need the truth. I need that horse." Coulter spun back, his patience snapping. "The truth. You want the truth. The truth is, we just left the horse. We escaped with our lives, and a book that horse is still in Murdoch's barn. And by now, Fitch has him halfway to the county line." Lark Monroe stood very still. The wind whipped her straw-colored hair across her face, but she didn't blink. Her winter sky eyes were fixed on his, and the fire in them was brighter than the lantern she'd thrown. "The truth is," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet, "that book is the horse. And the truth is, if you take me to your ranch tonight, you'll have the war you're so afraid of. But you and I were going to get that horse back." The wind on the high mesa was a blade. It sliced through the chaparral, carrying the scent of pine and the cold iron promise of a dawn still an hour away. They rode in silence, two shadows moving against the dark, Coulter on Silas, and Lark, riding bareback on the stolen white stallion. They hadn't spoken since leaving Brimstone Creek. The plan had been hers, executed with Coulter's grim efficiency. After the fire in the ravine, Fitch and Murdoch hadn't returned to the impound. As Lark had predicted, they'd moved the stallion, their most valuable and most dangerous piece of evidence. They'd taken him to a small, private holding pen behind the Coyote Ladder Saloon, a place owned by Ivory Nell. They'd left one man to guard him, a heavy-set drinker named Silas. It had been almost too easy. Lark, moving like a wraith, had slipped into the alley, making a sound like a hurt coyote that drew the guard away from his post. The moment his back was turned, Coulter had stepped from the shadow. There was no fight, just a single, muffled thud as Coulter's pistol barrel met the man's temple, hard enough to drop him, not hard enough to kill. Then, Lark. She hadn't used the gate. She'd climbed the corral fence, balancing on the top rail. Comet Jack had been frantic, circling, snorting in the dark. Coulter had watched, his own gun drawn, as she dropped into the center of the pen. She hadn't approached the horse. She'd just stood still and begun to hum. A low, strange, tuneless sound. The stallion had stopped, his head coming up, ears pricked. He'd taken one step, then another. In less than a minute, his great white head was pressed against her chest. She'd led him to the gate, unlatched it, and mounted Silas, which Coulter had brought forward. Coulter, in one fluid motion, had vaulted onto the stallion's bare back, his rancher's thighs gripping the horse's powerful ribs, and they had vanished, melting into the arroyos, leaving a sleeping guard and a stolen horse behind. Now, as the first gray light began to bruise the eastern sky, they crested the final ridge. The dark, solitary shape of the Ash Willow Ranch sat below them, the cabin a lightless box, the barn a long shadow. Coulter slid from the stallion's back, landing with a soft thud. He led the horse into the barn. It was warmer inside, smelling of old hay and leather. He settled Comet Jack into the largest stall, the one he'd kept empty since Alara's mare had died. He gave him water and a measure of oats, his movements economical, quiet. Lark followed him, a small, silent ghost swallowed by the shadows. She hadn't said a word. The adrenaline of the escape had fled, leaving a deep, bone-chilling cold in its wake. She was trembling, her hands shoved deep into her pockets, her torn shirt offering no protection. Coulter finished with the horse and turned to her. He didn't speak, just jerked his head toward the cabin. The small house was colder than the barn. The air was dead and icy. Coulter went straight to the pot-bellied stove in the center of the single room. He crouched, his back to her, and began to lay a fire tinder, kindling, a few split logs. The scratch of the match was loud in the stillness, and the flame caught, a small, hopeful flicker. Lark hadn't moved from the doorway. She was watching the room, her eyes taking in the single cot, the sparse, masculine furniture, the layer of dust on Alara's old rocking chair. Coulter stood. He walked to a wooden chest at the foot of his cot and lifted the lid. He pulled out a thick woven wool poncho, patterned in dark reds and grays. It was old, but clean. He walked over to her and held it out. She looked at it, then at him. "It's clean," he said, his voice rough from the cold. "It'll be warmer than that." She nodded, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her torn shirt. She turned her back to him, a gesture of assumed privacy, and shrugged out of the ruined garment. For a second, he saw the sharp, vulnerable line of her spine, the map of old bruises on her skin. He turned away, staring hard at the growing fire. He heard the soft brush of the wool as it settled over her shoulders. When he turned back, she was enveloped in it, the heavy fabric hanging almost to her knees, her small, pale face framed by the collar. She looked like a child playing dress-up, but her eyes were ancient. She went to the stove, holding her hands out to the metal that was just beginning to warm, but the shivers wouldn't stop. They were deep, rattling convulsions that shook her whole frame. Coulter watched her for a beat. He poured a splash of whiskey, his only luxury, into a tin cup, but hesitated. He put it down and grabbed the tin coffee pot, filled it from the water bucket, and set it on the stove to boil. She was still shaking. Her hands, held to the stove, were white-knuckled and turning blue. "You'll lose a finger 'fore that stove heats," he said gruffly. He stepped in front of her, closer than he'd been since the fall in the hay. She flinched, but held her ground. "Give me your hands," he commanded. She hesitated, then slowly extended them. They were small, icy, the knuckles raw, the nails broken. He took them. His own hands were huge, rough as tree bark, and radiating a dry heat. He chafed her cold hands between his palms, his grip firm, impersonal, but the shaking didn't stop. He sighed, a small puff of frustration. He looked at her face, her lips chapped and pale. He lifted her hands, still wrapped in his, and raised them to his mouth. He blew into the cup of his palms, his breath a cloud of hot steam in the frigid room. It was a simple, practical act, the kind of thing a man might do to thaw a frozen buckle or warm a newborn calf. But it wasn't impersonal. Lark went utterly still. Her shaking stopped. replaced by a sudden, rigid tension. She was staring at him, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. The distance between them was nothing. It was the space of a single whisper. He could smell the lye soap on her skin and the dust of the road in her hair. He could see the faint constellation of freckles across her nose. He held her hands, breathing warmth into them. 1, 2, 3. Her gaze dropped from his eyes to his mouth. He felt the shift, the air crackling between them, becoming thick and heavy. He thought, for one wild, irrational second, of juniper wash, of loneliness, of the simple, devastating weight of another human being. He dropped her hands as if they'd burned him. He stepped back, turning sharply to the stove.
Coffee's almost ready.
Lark released the breath she'd been holding. She wrapped her arms around herself, under the poncho, and sagged against the wall. The cabin was silent, save for the hiss of the warming stove and the plink of the coffee pot. "My PA," she said, her voice quiet, directed at the floor. "He was a farrier, a traveling one. We never stayed in one place more than a few months." Coulter leaned against the dry sink, his arms crossed, listening. "He didn't talk much," she continued, "but he taught me horses. He'd put my ear to the hoof, listen. He'd say, 'A hoofbeat is a song, a limp is a sour note, a good gait is a rhythm. You just gotta learn the tune.' I learned. I could tell what a horse needed just by the sound of its walk." She looked up, her eyes finding his. "That's how I got to Painted Butte. I wasn't just a groom, I was their best trainer. Comet Jack, I raised him from a foal. He was all fire and lightning. I taught him to trust, to run for joy, not fear." She paused, pulling the poncho tighter. "When the track was sold, I was out. I came to Brimstone Creek looking for work. I went to the Coyote Ladder, not for that, to see if any ranchers needed a hand. Ivory Nell was there." Coulter knew Nell, a woman carved from ice, who ran the saloon in half the town with a diamond-fisted grip. She was charming, offered me a drink. We played a hand of cards. I lost $10 I didn't have. She said I could work it off, mucking stalls at her livery, but that $10, it never went down. It just grew. A broken glass was $5. A late morning was 2 more. Soon, I owed her $50. I was trapped. Then Sheriff Murdoch came. He bought my debt, transferred my servitude to the town impound. I thought it was a blessing, until I saw what they were doing. Her voice dropped, hardening. They were bringing in stolen stock, good horses, and swapping their papers with broken-down ranch plugs. Fitch's straw bale scheme. They'd sell the good horses back east with bad papers for a few dollars, and sell the plugs to new miners with the thoroughbred papers for a fortune. And then they brought in Comet Jack. Her voice broke, just for a second. They'd seized him on a fake gambling charge. They had papers for him. All right, papers for a 10-year-old plow horse. They were going to sell him as a plug. And they were hurting him, to make him seem broken. That's when I found the real stud book, hidden in an old grain bin. That's when I knew I had to get him out, or die. Coulter listened, his face an unreadable mask. The story resonated with a sickening familiarity. A legal trap, a manufactured debt, a lawful theft. He pushed off the counter and walked to the single, grimy window, looking out at the gray morning light painting his empty yard. "Juniper wash," he said, the words tasting like ash. "That's where my wife, that's where she died. 3 years ago." Lark watched him, silent. "They called it a rock slide," Coulter said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Freak accident. I found tracks, 2 horses shod, up on the ridge above the slide, where no one had any business being. I told Murdoch. He smiled. Told me grief makes a man see things. He filed the report. Accident." He turned from the window. "I sold off half my stock. I let my hands go. All except old Theo. I kept just enough to keep the bank off. It's easier to keep the gate closed. Fewer strays. Fewer losses." He looked at her. his eyes as bleak as the mesa. "I closed the gate on everyone. Miss Monroe, I've got no war left in me." "A closed gate doesn't stop the wolves." "Mr. Vale," Lark said softly, echoing her own words from the granary. "It just traps you inside with them."
The sun was up when he woke. He'd slumped in the chair by the stove, the shotgun across his lap. He'd given Lark the cot. He woke with a start, the chair creaking. She was gone. A cold spike of panic, sharper than the morning air, hit him. He grabbed his gun and bolted from the cabin, his heart pounding. He ran to the barn, shoving the heavy door open. He found her in the stall. The barn was filled with soft, hazy light. Comet Jack, the horse that had been a trembling, violent mass of nerves in Murdoch's possession, was standing perfectly still. His great white head was resting on Lark's shoulder, his eyes half closed. She was humming, that same low, tuneless song. She was stroking his neck, her touch light as a feather. The scene was one of absolute peace, a moment of healing, stark against the violence of the night. "Well," a gruff voice drawled from behind Coulter. "You found a stray, boss, and a damned expensive one. At that." Coulter turned. Theo Pike, his only hand, stood there, a hay fork in one hand. Theo was 60, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, and he moved with a permanent hitch from a broken hip. He'd forgotten more about horses than Coulter would ever know. "Theo," Coulter said. "This is Lark Monroe. This is Comet Jack." Theo's sharp blue eyes took in the girl, then the horse. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Is it now?" He walked past Coulter, his limp pronounced. Lark tensed as the old man approached, her hand tightening on the horse's mane. "Easy, girl," Theo said, not looking at her. He was talking to the horse. He ran a practiced, unforgiving hand down the stallion's leg, checking the cannon bone. He examined the needle mark on the shoulder. "Murdoch's work, or Fitch's. Sloppy." He moved to the horse's flank, pushing back the thick white coat, and then he stopped. "Well, I'll be damned." Deep in the hair, so faint it was almost invisible, was a small, perfectly healed scar. It was shaped like a tiny flicker of flame. "I saw this stud run at the High Plains Derby 2 seasons ago," Theo said, his voice hushed with reverence. "He was a legend. They called this his fire scar. Got it when a branding iron slipped on his dam and brushed him. They said it was his luck. This," he patted the horse's flank, "is Comet Jack. All right, 100%. He looked at Coulter, then at Lark. "Which means whatever paper Murdoch's holding is worth less than the mud on my boot." They stood outside the stall, the three of them, the proof hanging in the air. Coulter looked at the horse. It was his. He had the bloodline he needed. He could hide the horse, rebrand him, call him Ghost or Snow. He could breed him in secret. He could survive. Lark looked at him, her face pale in the morning light, but her eyes steady. "So," she said, her voice quiet, "you have your horse. Is that what you wanted? Just the horse?" Coulter hesitated. Just the horse. The words echoed in his head. That's what he'd ridden for. That meant hiding. It meant letting Murdoch and Fitch win. It meant Juniper Wash was just a rock slide. "Or," Lark pressed, her voice gaining a thin, steel edge, "do you want justice?" Justice. The word was a punch to the gut. Justice meant war. It meant opening the gate. It meant everything he'd spent 3 years burying. He looked at the horse, this magnificent creature, a symbol of everything that could be stolen. Then he looked at Lark, a small, fierce woman who had been brutalized but refused to be broken. She was the first person in 3 years who hadn't looked at him with pity, but with a challenge. He made the choice. He turned his back on the barn. He walked to the cabin door, opened it, and held it, the morning sun spilling into the dark room. He looked at Lark, who hadn't moved. He offered his hand, Not to pull her, not to force her, but as an invitation. "Come home," Coulter Vale said. Lark's breath hitched. Her eyes searched his, looking for a trap, for pity, for the lie. She found none. She saw only a cold, hard decision. A man opening a door he had long since nailed shut. She took one, long second. Then she walked forward and placed her small, scarred hand in his. The contact was firm, a pact sealed. They walked toward the ranch house. As they passed the gate, the old, weathered ash willow ranch sign stirred in the breeze, its hinges giving a long, low creak like a sigh of relief. He was on the porch, pouring 2 cups of coffee, black and bitter. She came out, wrapped in the poncho, and took the cup from him. She leaned against the railing, looking out at the vast, beautiful, terrifying expanse of Raven Mesa. A small, slow smile touched her lips. It was the first real smile he had seen on her face. "From now on," Lark Monroe said, the steam from the cup warming her face, "we call it home, for now." The silence of Ash Willow Ranch was different now. For 3 years, it had been an empty, hollow thing, a void that echoed the wind. Now, the silence was full. It was the sound of another person breathing in the next room, the soft scrape of a boot on the porch, the rhythmic thump-pull of a needle through thick leather. Lark Monroe had not been idle for a single moment. She had claimed the barn as her sanctuary. On the first day, Coulter found her sitting on the packed earth floor, his wife's old, neglected saddle laid across her lap in pieces. The leather was cracked, the fleece lining rotten. "It's good leather," she'd said, not looking up. "Just thirsty." She worked with a quiet, fierce concentration. She soaked the leather in neat's foot oil, her small, scarred hands working the suppleness back into the stiff material. She restitched the seams with an awl and sinew, her movements precise, economical. She was humming, not the tune she'd used to calm the horse, but a different one, a simple, repetitive air that sounded like work. Coulter watched her. He was a man who knew tack, but he was a rancher. He mended things to be functional. She mended them to be right. "You're not listening," she told him, when he was brushing down Comet Jack. Coulter paused, brush in hand. "Listening to what the wind—" "To him," she tapped the stallion's ribs. "You're brushing him like you're sweeping a floor. You have to listen for the breath. Put the blanket on, slow. Watch his ears. Wait, he'll tell you if it pinches. He'll tell you if the bit is cold." She looked at Coulter, her gaze serious. "A horse's comfort ain't a luxury. Mr. Vale, it's how you stay alive." He'd grunted, but he'd slowed down. He'd started to listen. He'd spent so long just surviving. He'd forgotten how to pay attention. That night, they ate in the cabin. The room was small, and her presence seemed to fill every corner. He'd made what he always made, beans boiled with salt pork, and a skillet of cornbread. He set a tin plate in front of her without a word. They ate in silence. Coulter was halfway through his meal when a sudden, brazen movement made him look up. A blur of mottled fur and claws shot from under the stove, landed on the table, and snatched the piece of salt pork from Coulter's own plate. "Damn it, Sawyer," Coulter growled, swiping at the barn cat. The cat, a one-eyed, mangy creature Coulter tolerated for its mousing skills, hissed and vanished back into the shadows. Coulter looked at his plate, then at Lark. He was expecting her to be startled, or shy. She was covering her mouth, her shoulders shaking. A sound came out of her, a bright, sudden burst of sound that Coulter hadn't heard in this cabin for 3 years. She was laughing. It was a real, unguarded laugh, a sound that chased the dust from the corners. "He's fast," she managed to say, her eyes bright with unshed tears of mirth. Coulter looked at his empty plate, at the spot where the pork had been. A slow, rusty smile cracked his own face. "He's a thief." "He's a survivor," she corrected. her smile softening. He just took what he needed. The tension broke. The air in the cabin felt warmer. The cabin was still a single room. He had his cot, and she had taken to sleeping on a bedroll by the stove, wrapped in his poncho. It was an arrangement that grated on Coulter's sense of decency, and, if he was honest, on his nerves. Having her that close, hearing her breathe in the dark, was unsettling. The next day, he started working on the old tack room attached to the barn. It had a solid door and a small, cracked window. He spent the morning patching the roof and sweeping out the old nests. He found a small, cast-iron cot frame, rusted but solid, and dragged it inside. Lark found him there in the afternoon, as he was trying to reset the window pane. "What's this?" she asked. "It's not the house," he said gruffly, not looking at her, his fingers working with the putty. "But it's dry, and the door has a lock. Give you a corner of your own, if you want it." She was quiet for a long moment. He could feel her gaze on his back. "A corner," she said, her voice soft. "A corner with a lock. I thank you, Coulter." He just nodded, focusing intently on the window. He'd built her a place, but he was also building a wall. It was safer for them both. The day settled into a rhythm. Coulter and Theo Pike worked the fence line on the north pasture, while Lark worked with the horses. She was a natural. She didn't break them, she convinced them. By the third day, even Coulter's stubborn roan, Silas, was dropping his head for the bridle. The healing was slow, but it was steady. One evening, just before sundown, Coulter was coming back from the spring, 2 heavy buckets of water in his hands. He stopped. Lark was at the well by the side of the cabin. She had stripped off the dirty, oversized man's shirt she'd been wearing over her chemise. She was in her thin undergarment, her back to him, her pale shoulders exposed to the cooling air. She was washing her hair. He saw her pour a bucket of cold well water over her head. The gasp of the cold sharp in the quiet. He saw her scrubbing her scalp with his bar of harsh lye soap. He should have turned away. He should have gone inside. But he stood, frozen. He saw the sharp line of her spine, the bruises on her wrist that were finally fading from purple to a sick yellow-green. She looked small, fragile, and desperately out of place, like a piece of fine porcelain in a mule trough. A knot tightened in his chest. It was a feeling he recognized. It was the feeling of seeing something, or someone, utterly defenseless. He set his own buckets down. He went back to the cabin, stoked the fire in the stove, and put the kettle on. When it was steaming, he poured the hot water into a clean bucket, grabbed the last clean dry towel from his chest, and went back outside. She was shivering, her wet, straw-colored hair plastered to her back, her hands blue as she tried to work the soap out. He stopped a good 10 feet behind her. "Lark!" She whirled around, her hands flying up to cover herself, her eyes wide with panic. Coulter instantly turned his back to her. He held his gaze steady on the darkening line of Raven Mesa. I'm not looking," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. I brought hot water, and a towel. The lie, it's harsh. Needs hot water." He set the steaming bucket and the towel on the wellstone, his back still to her. "I'll leave it." He started to walk away. "Wait!" He stopped. He heard the sound of her lifting the bucket, the small sigh of relief as the hot water hit. He heard her rinsing, her movements quick now. "Thank you," she said, her voice small. He chanced to look over his shoulder. She had wrapped the towel around her hair like a turban, and she'd pulled the poncho back on over her damp chemise. The steam rose from the bucket and her wet shoulders, clouding the air between them. Her face was flushed, her eyes wary. No one's brought me hot water in a long time," she said. He just nodded, his throat tight. "Best get inside before you catch a chill." He picked up his own buckets and walked to the cabin. The image of her, shrouded in steam and vulnerability, burning itself into his mind. The next morning, the fragile peace was shattered. Theo Pike had been examining Comet Jack, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Lark was beside him, cleaning the stallion's hooves. "What in tarnation is this?" Lark said, using a hoof pick to scrape at a spot on the sole. Theo bent closer, his knees cracking. He pulled a small knife from his pocket and scraped at the hoof's frog. A fleck of dark blue paint chipped off. "Well now," Theo muttered, "that's how they do it." Coulter, coiling a rope nearby, walked over. "How they do what?" "It's a swap marker," Theo said, standing up. "Barlow Fitch's whole game. They get 2 horses, one fast, one slow, that look near identical. They paint a mark, deep in the hoof where no one looks. Blue for the winner, red for the loser. They run 'em in a dusty race. The crowd bets on the favorite. But Fitch's men, they know to look for the blue paint. They clean up." Lark stood, her face grim. "They weren't just swapping papers. They were running a fixed game right under Murdoch's nose." "Under his nose," Theo spat. "He was in on it, girl. He was the one collecting the fees. And that ain't all." The old man turned to Coulter, his expression dark. "Barlow Fitch has been after this ranch for a year. Coulter, ever since Alara." He stopped and cleared his throat. "He wants to buy Ash Willow. Made you an offer last spring. You turned him down." "I know," Coulter said. "He wants my water rights." "No, boss," Theo said, shaking his head. "He don't care about the water. He wants your pass. He wants Red Bottle Pass." Coulter froze. Red Bottle Pass was the narrow, treacherous trail that cut through the back of his property, leading north to the high plains. It was quicker than the main road, but dangerous. "It's the only way," Theo explained. "To move a large herd to the railhead at Stone Lantern without passing the new federal marshal's office? It's a smuggler's highway. If Fitch controls this ranch, he controls all the stolen horses moving in and out of this territory." The blood drained from Coulter's face. It all clicked into place. The tracks at Juniper Wash, the accident, the immediate offer from Fitch. They hadn't just wanted Alara gone, they'd wanted him gone. They'd wanted him broken, scared, willing to sell. And it had worked. Lark was watching him, her eyes sharp. She saw the blood drain from his face, saw the way his hands clenched into fists, then went slack. She saw the fight go out of him, replaced by that same cold, hollow look he'd worn when she first saw him. "Coulter," she said. "No," he whispered, backing away from the barn. "From them. He can have it. I can't." He was seeing the rock slide. He was seeing the fresh-turned earth of the grave he'd dug with his own hands. "I won't fight him," Coulter said, his voice flat. "I won't let it happen again." He turned and walked toward the emptiness of the open mesa, his steps quickening, fleeing. Lark's face hardened. The softness from the well, the laughter over the stolen bacon. It all evaporated. She looked at Theo, then at Coulter's retreating back. A cold fire lit her eyes. "If we don't stand," she said, her voice low and sharp as flint, "they will stomp on us. They won't stop at the gate just because he's decided to close it." She went to the barn. She threw a blanket on Comet Jack. She put the bridle on, her movements quick, angry, and sure. By the time the moon, a sliver of bone, rose over the mesa, Coulter was sitting on a rock, a mile from the ranch, his head in his hands. He heard the hoofbeats before he saw her. She wasn't riding Silas. She was on Comet Jack, riding him bareback, just a bridle. The white stallion moved like a ghost over the silver grass flat, his hooves making almost no sound. She pulled him up, 10 feet away. "You're a coward," she said. It wasn't an insult. It was a statement of fact. "You don't know what you're talking about," he bit out. "I know they killed your wife," she said. He flinched as if she'd struck him. "I told you." "You told me it was an accident Murdoch covered up. Now you know why. And you're going to sit here and let them take this. Let them win. Let her death mean nothing." "Get off my land!" he snarled, standing up. It's not your land, she shot back. It's theirs. You're just squatting on it until they decide to kick you off. A rage, cold and pure, surged through Coulter. He strode to his horse, Silas, who had been grazing nearby. He vaulted into the saddle. I'll show you whose land it is, he said, and spurred the roan into a dead run. She was right behind him. They raced across the open flat, the wind tearing at their faces. This wasn't a ride. It was a battle. Coulter pushed Silas, his reliable, steady mount, harder than he ever had. But Comet Jack was flying. Lark, riding bareback, her hair unbound and streaming behind her like a pale banner, moved as one with the stallion. She pulled alongside Coulter, her face set, her eyes fixed forward. They thundered across the moonlit plain, heartbeats and hoofbeats pounding out the same frantic, desperate rhythm. It was reckless. It was madness. And it was the first time in 3 years Coulter had felt anything other than grief or numbness. He felt alive. He spurred Silas harder, but the stallion was beside him, effortless. They were neck and neck, a storm of dust and shadows. Finally, at the edge of a high bluff overlooking the vast, empty territory, Coulter pulled his horse to a gasping, trembling halt. Lark pulled up beside him. The horses were lathered, their sides heaving, clouds of steam pluming from their nostrils in the cold night air. Coulter was breathing as hard as his horse. He looked at Lark, her face flushed, her chest rising and falling. He reached out. He didn't know what he intended to do. He just reached. His hand, calloused and shaking, landed on Comet Jack's neck, trying to steady the horse, or maybe himself. His hand covered hers. She was already there, her small hand pressed flat against the stallion's damp hide. The shock of the touch, skin on skin, was electric, a jolt that went straight through his arm and into his chest. He didn't pull away. She didn't pull away. He turned his head. She turned hers. In the pale moonlight, they were suddenly, impossibly close. Close enough to feel the heat from her skin. Close enough to see the exhaustion and the fire warring in her eyes. Their foreheads were inches apart. It was an acknowledgement, a surrender, an unspoken admission that they were bound, not just by the horse, but by the war that was coming. "I am afraid, Lark," Coulter whispered, the admission torn from him. "I'm afraid of what they'll do, of failing again." Lark's gaze was steady. She didn't move her hand from under his. She stared out at the dark, vast land that Fitch wanted to steal. "I was afraid every day in Brimstone Creek," she said, her voice a low, fierce rasp. "I was afraid until I saw you in that barn, and then I just got angry. I'm done being afraid." She leaned in, and for one brief, grounding second, she pressed her forehead against his. It was a gesture of solidarity, of strength. It was not a kiss. It was a promise. She pulled back, her eyes holding his. "I'm not running away from them again. Coulter," she said. "The only way I'm running is if it's to pull you along with me." The moon on the high mesa had been a promise. The sun rising over the ranch was a deadline. The shift at Ash Willow was palpable. The quiet of healing had been replaced by the tense hum of preparation. The war Lark had promised was no longer a threat. It was a map, and they were finally drawing the lines. "We have the horse, and we have the stud book," Coulter said, his voice flat as he poured coffee in the pre-dawn chill. "That's my word against the sheriffs. In this territory, that's not enough." "Then we get more," Lark said. She was braiding Comet Jack's mane, her fingers working with a quick, nervous energy. "The book." She tapped the ledger she'd stolen, now hidden beneath a floorboard in her new room. "Is the what. We need the how and the who." "Fitch and Murdoch," Coulter said. "And Ivory Nell," Lark added, her voice hardening. "She holds the purse strings, and we need proof they didn't just seize a horse, but that they manufactured a fake." "The High Plains Breeders Association," Lark said, tying off the braid. Their registry is kept in Stone Lantern. It's the only official copy. Your stud book is a field copy, but the registry is law. We need to know who they say this horse is. Stone Lantern is a 2-day ride, Coulter said, his brow furrowing. Leaving the ranch, leaving you here, Fitch's men are watching. Fitch's men are watching for you, Lark countered. They're not watching for a ranch hand going to the Scrivener. She pulled her straw-colored hair back, tying it with a leather thong, her expression all business. Theo will go. He knows the territory. Theo Pike, who had been listening from the barn door, shook his head. Fitch's men know my limp better than I do. But you, he looked at Lark. They're looking for a victim, a girl in a poncho. They're not looking for a boy. An hour later, Lark rode out. She was dressed in a pair of Coulter's old, undersized canvas pants, held up with a length of rope. A floppy hat was pulled low, hiding her hair, and a dusty coat swallowed her small frame. She rode Silas, the steady roan, leading a pack mule. To any watcher, she was just a ranch boy heading to Stone Lantern for supplies. Coulter watched her from the ridge until she was a speck, his hand gripping a fence post, the knuckles white. Stone Lantern was a town built on paper, not dust. It was the county seat, full of lawyers, clerks, and land agents. Lark found the Scrivener's office, a small, neat building smelling of ink and dry glue. Evan Driscoll was a small, neat man, with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink stains on his cuffs. He was precisely the kind of man who hated trouble. I need to see the High Plains Registry, Lark said, laying $3 silver on his desk. The volume for 1871. Driscoll looked at the money, then at the boy in front of him, and sighed. He pulled a massive, leather-bound volume from a shelf. Lark turned the pages, her rough fingers surprisingly gentle. She found the entry for Comet Jack. It was all there, the dam, the sire, the foaling date, and in the margin, a handwritten note. Identifier small flame-shaped scar, left flank, result of dam's branding. Can I see the association seal? She asked. Confused, Driscoll pulled out a drawer. He showed her the official embossed stamp, a heavy piece of brass set in an iron press. This is what makes it legal. Lark pulled a folded piece of paper from her boot. It was the ownership document she'd seen tacked to the wall in Murdoch's barn, the one she'd grabbed before they fled. She laid it on the desk. Driscoll looked at it. He pushed his spectacles up his nose. This is a forgery. I know, Lark said. How? The seal, he said, tapping it. It's fuzzy. The edges aren't sharp. The official press is cut steel. This, he ran a finger over it. This was pressed from a mold, a copper mold, sand cast. I'd wager. It's a good fake, but it's a fake. Anyone who'd seen the real one would know. Lark nodded, retrieving the paper. Would you be willing to say that to a judge? Evan Driscoll paled. Say it against Sheriff Murdoch, young man. I am a scrivener. I write what I'm told. I do not testify. Thank you for your time. Mr. Driscoll, Lark said, scooping up her dollars. You've been a great help. She rode back, not as a boy, but as a storm cloud. She had the how. While she was gone, Theo Pike had followed his own trail. He'd taken Coulter to the other side of Brimstone Creek, to a small, tidy cabin that smelled of baking bread and lavender. He'd introduced Coulter to Martha Quayle. She was a widow, sharp as a tack at 73, and in a former life, she had been the official race registrar for the Brimstone Derby. Theo Pike, you old coyote! She'd cackled, swatting his arm. And this must be the hermit of Raven Mesa, Coulter Vale. Your wife, Ilara, she was a fine woman, a fine horsewoman. Ma'am, Coulter said, his hat in his hands, feeling awkward and large in her tiny parlor. Theo says you're asking about the painted butte string, she said, her bright eyes fixing on him. I'm asking about a white stallion, Coulter said, Comet Jack. Martha's smile vanished. That horse, it was a tragedy. What they said happened. A jewel like that, I saw him run his first race, all fire and hope.
You remember him? Then,
Remember him? She laughed. Son, I remember the sire of every decent horse in this territory. I remember him because of the mark. His dam was a nervous filly, and she shied at the branding. The iron slipped, just brushed the colt, left a scar, a little flicker of flame, right on his flank. I recorded it myself. That's a mark from God. That is, can't be faked.
would you swear to that, Mrs. Quayle? Coulter asked, his voice low. Martha Quayle looked out her window, toward the town, toward the sheriff's office. I'm an old woman, Mr. Vale. Barlow Fitch is a hard man, Murdoch is his dog. I've lived this long by baking my bread and keeping my door shut. They're using that mark, Coulter said, to steal. They're planning to use him to cheat the whole town at the Derby. The old woman's eyes flashed. The Brimstone Derby was her legacy. Cheat, she said, her voice like ice. At my Derby. When Lark returned, they gathered in the barn, the three of them, a council of war. So, Lark said, Driscoll can confirm the forged seal. Martha Quayle can identify the real scar. We have the how and the who. It's still not enough, Coulter said, pacing the length of the barn. It's our word. They'll say the horse we have is the fake. They'll say we forged the scar. Lark was quiet, her hands busy, as they always were. She was working on a new headstall for Comet Jack, cutting a long strip of supple, dark leather. Then we make new proof that only we know. She held up the rein. She'd modified the buckle. It was a strange, intricate brass thing. My PA made this. It's a locking buckle. It passes through, but it won't come back out unless you have the key. She held up a thin, steel pin, no thicker than a darning needle. The head of it was etched with a tiny, swirling L. I'll braid this into his mane, deep under the crest. If they take him, they can't get the bridle off. They'll have to cut the leather. A cut rein is a confession. Coulter stopped pacing. He looked at her, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes, at the clever, practical solution in her hands. Lark, that's brilliant. It's just leather and steel, she said, avoiding his gaze. Now, we have the horse, but we need to know the plan. What are they doing with him? We need to hear it from their own mouths. This, Coulter knew, was his job. He couldn't send Lark, and he couldn't send Theo. Brecken Hale was a ghost. He haunted the alleys behind the coyote ladder, a man who'd once been the fastest jockey in the territory. Coulter found him there, sharing a bottle with another down-on-his-luck rider. Coulter dropped a $20 gold piece into Hale's tin cup. The clink was loud in the alley. Brecken looked up, his eyes bleary. Vale, you're poison! I need to know Fitch's transport schedule. Coulter said, Go to hell. Fitch ruined you, Brecken, Coulter said, his voice low. I heard it was a doped mare. Snapped her leg on the last turn. He's doing the same to Comet Jack. Brecken's hand closed around the gold piece. He was silent for a full minute. They're not moving him. Not Jack. They're moving the other one. The other one? A double, Brecken slurred, his voice bitter. A white gelding from up north. Looks just like him, except slower than molasses. Fitch has been training him in secret, up at the old sheep-shearing camp. They did something to his flank, branded him, to match. They're going to run the fake. Coulter breathed, the pieces clicking into place. They run the fake, Brecken said. The odds are high on Comet Jack. The fake loses. Fitch and Nell, they bettin' the other way. They'll clean out the whole town. Then Murdoch will seize your horse, the real one, as stolen, and Fitch ships him east. Everyone wins, except you and the town. Where is this camp? Brecken told him. That night, Coulter and Lark rode out. They left Theo on the ridge with a rifle. The shearing camp was desolate, a collection of ruined shacks, in a rickety corral, under the moon. stood a white horse. From a distance, it was Jack. Lark slipped through the rails like a snake. Coulter covered her, his rifle up. She approached the horse, humming her low. Strange tune. The horse shied, snorting. It wasn't Jack. Lark ran her hand along its flank. She stopped. "Coulter, bring the lantern." He came, shielding the light. There, on the horse's flank, was a scar. A perfect, flame-shaped scar. Lark leaned closer, her nose wrinkled. "It smells wrong." She scraped it with her fingernail. A piece of the scar flaked off. "It's hide," she whispered, her voice sick. "It's a patch. They've glued a patch of scarred hide onto him. It's ghoulish." They backed away. They now had the linchpin. The fake horse! "But," Lark whispered, as they rode back, "we still don't have them." Brecken said they're meeting. Coulter said, "Tomorrow night, at the Coyote Ladder, Nell, Murdoch, and Fitch, to finalize the plan for the Derby." Lark's mind was working, her eyes distant. "I need a long piece of wire, and a tin can. And Theo, did the doctor who set your hip, did he leave his stethoscope?" The attic of the Coyote Ladder saloon was thick with dust, heat, and the smell of stale beer. Lark lay flat on the rough boards, her ear pressed to a gap. Below them, in Ivory Nell's private office, the meeting was starting. Lark had done it. She'd found a ventilation shaft, a small 2-inch pipe. She'd fed a thin copper wire down it, a tin can tied to the end, dangling just above the desk in the office below. The other end of the wire was wrapped tightly around the metal bell of Theo's old stethoscope. She wasn't alone. She'd forced Evan Driscoll to come. "This is insane," the scrivener was whispering, his body trembling in the dark. "If they find us—" "If they don't find us," Lark had countered, her voice cold. "And we fail, who do you think they'll silence first? The old woman who remembers the scar, or the scrivener who knows the seal is fake? You're in this, Mr. Driscoll. Now, be quiet and listen." She put the earpieces of the stethoscope in his ears. Driscoll's eyes went wide. He could hear them, clear as a bell. "The odds are set." Ivory Nell's smooth voice purred. "Everyone is betting on the legend. They're fools." "And the rancher," Murdoch's gruff voice. "Fitch, your boys are watching him." "He's pinned down," Barlow Fitch's dry rasp. "He won't move. He's a coward. He's been hiding for 3 years. "Good," Murdoch said. "So, the plan holds. We run the fake. He loses at the 3rd turn. You," he said to Nell. "Collect the bets. I," he said to Fitch. "Seize the real horse from Vale's ranch as stolen property immediately after the race. We ship him to St. Louis by midnight. A clean sweep." "And the girl?" Nell asked. "The girl," Fitch said, his voice as cold as a grave, "will be dealt with. Once we have the horse, she has no purpose." In the attic, Driscoll was shaking so hard he was vibrating. Lark took the stethoscope from him. She handed him a pencil and a small notebook. "Write," she commanded in a whisper. "Write down every word you just heard, and then you're going to sign it, and I'm going to be your witness." They slipped out as the sky was turning gray. They rode hard. As they crested the ridge to Ash Willow, a rifle shot cracked the dawn. A bullet kicked up dust 10 feet from Silas's hooves. A warning. "Fitch's boys," Coulter said, his face grim. "They know we're moving." They slammed the cabin door. Barring it, the evidence was on the table. Driscoll's affidavit, signed with a trembling hand. A scraping of the fake scar, wrapped in cloth. Lark's design for the locking rein. Coulter's eyes were different. The defensive, haunted look was gone. It had been burned away, replaced by a cold, offensive fire. "We have it all." Coulter said, "We take this to the federal marshal in Stone Lantern." "No." Lark's voice was sharp, cutting through his. She stood at the window, staring at the barn.
where Comet Jack was hidden. We take this to a marshal, and Fitch's money or Fitch's bullet will stop us before we get there. It's paper. Coulter. They'll just burn it. They'll say Driscoll is a liar, that Martha is a senile old woman. A public fight, half-cocked, will get us killed. Then what? He demanded. We need a stage, she said, turning to him. We need the whole territory watching. They're all coming for the Brimstone Derby. Right, Murdoch, Fitch, Nell. They're setting a trap for the whole town. They're planning to run the fake, Coulter said, the plan forming in his own mind, grafting onto hers. They expect him to lose. Lark's smile was thin, and it was terrifying. He will, but he won't be the only Comet Jack in that race. Coulter stared at her. The audacity of it. We enter the real Comet Jack, Lark said, her voice dropping. Intense. We run him against their fake. We don't just win, Coulter. We win in front of everyone. And then, she slapped the affidavit on the table. When the whole town is watching, that's when we show them the real horse, the real scar, the fake scar, and the sheriff's own confession. Coulter looked at the woman in front of him. She wasn't a victim. She was a general. He nodded once, a slow, final movement. Get that horse ready. Coulter Vale said, We're going to the Derby. The Brimstone Derby was not a race, it was a fever. It was the one day of the year the town's raw, scabbed-over desperation was allowed to boil over. The air was thick with the smell of horse sweat, cheap whiskey, and the metallic tang of bloodlust. Dust, kicked up by 1,000 boots, hung in the air, a red shroud that caught the high noon sun and turned it a bruised orange. From the rickety, unpainted grandstand, the roar of the crowd was a physical thing, a single, horse-throated beast. Miners, ranchers, drifters, and saloon girls were packed shoulder to shoulder, waving cash and betting slips, money, earned through back-breaking labor or the turn of a lucky card, flew like dry leaves, wagered on the thinnest of hopes. At the center of this maelstrom, perched on a private platform draped in red velvet, sat the architects of the day's corruption, Ivory Nell, her face a mask of pale, powdered calm, sipped from a delicate glass. Barlow Fitch stood beside her, a black-clad specter, his eyes missing nothing, and below them, strutting with the false bravado of a king, Sheriff Murdoch patrolled the track, his hand resting on his sidearm, ensuring the peace. On the ground, in the chaos of the paddocks, Coulter Vale, Lark Monroe, and Theo Pike were an island of cold purpose. Coulter, his face grim, his duster brushing the dirt, moved through the crowd not as a spectator, but as a sapper laying a charge. He'd already placed their meager $20 bet a public act, but his real work was by the wagon they'd parked near the judge's stand, a large, canvas tarped object that looked like nothing more than a rancher's supplies. Lark was the eye of their storm. She was small, almost swallowed by the chaos. She wasn't wearing racing silks, just her own patched canvas trousers and a sturdy shirt. She was light, she was strong, and she knew the horse better than she knew her own heart. She stood by Comet Jack's head, her hand on his bridle, her eyes on his, whispering to him. She was humming her tune, a low, grounding note in the cacophony. The white stallion, who should have been frantic, was preternaturally calm, his head bowed, listening only to her. They're running him, Theo muttered, nodding toward the track. A groom was leading a magnificent white horse, identical to Jack, onto the dirt. Entry number 4, Storm Anthem. It was the fake, the horse from the shearing camp, with its gruesome, glued-on scar. He's doped, Lark said, not taking her eyes off Jack. You can see it in his walk. He's numb. They don't want him to run fast. They just want him to look right when he loses. All riders, mount up, the announcer bellowed. Coulter came to Lark. He gripped her shoulder, his hand hard. The plan is the plan, no matter what.
You ride your race. I'll handle the rest. Lark looked up at him. The fear that had lived in her eyes for months was gone, scoured clean by a cold, righteous anger. She just nodded. She gathered the reins, the special, custom-made bridle with its locking clasp, and Coulter gave her a leg up. She settled onto the stallion's back as if she'd been born there. She was the sixth rider, the last-minute entry from Ash Willow Ranch, the one the betting men were laughing at. The odds against her were 50-1. They lined up, a ragged collection of 6 horses. Lark kept Comet Jack at the far outside, away from the jostling. She saw Murdoch, standing by the rail. He wasn't looking at the horses. He was looking at a man, a rough-looking drifter, standing by the third turn. Murdoch gave a short, sharp nod. The man nodded back and disappeared behind the spectator line. The trap. Coulter saw it, too. His hand moved instinctively toward his pistol, but he stopped. It was too late. The plan was in motion. It was all on Lark. A gunshot split the air. The race began in a violent explosion of dirt and muscle. The crowd's roar became a scream. Lark held Jack back, letting the others fight for the inside rail. She didn't want to be part of their chaos. She let them go, settling Jack into a long, loping stride, a full 3 lengths behind the pack. Fools, Ivory Nell laughed, watching through her opera glasses. She's afraid to even run. Fitch said nothing. He just watched. The first turn was a blur. The second, Storm Anthem, the fake, was running mid-pack, his jockey holding him in, making it look like a struggle. As they came onto the backstretch, Lark let out the rein. Just a fraction. "Now, Jack," she whispered. Just a little. It was as if she'd flipped a switch. Comet Jack lengthened his stride. He didn't just accelerate, he uncoiled. He moved from 6th place to 4th, then 3rd. He wasn't running. He was flying. The ground didn't seem to be an obstacle. It was a drum he was beating, a rhythm she knew by heart. The crowd saw it. A gasp went up. The laughter stopped. The people who had bet on the favorite began to look nervous. "What is she doing?" Murdoch snarled. "It doesn't matter," Fitch said, his voice a dry rasp. "She won't make the 3rd turn." They were coming in hot. Comet Jack had pulled alongside Storm Anthem. The 2 white horses, one real, one fake, were running neck and neck. The crowd was going insane. Lark was low, her face in his mane. The wind was a physical blow, stinging her eyes, ripping the air from her lungs. The world narrowed to the 10 feet of dark, churned earth in front of her and the space between Jack's ears. Then she felt it. It wasn't something she saw. It was a change in the horse. Jack's breathing, the steady, rhythmic huff, 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 hitched. He smelled it before she did, the acrid, sharp smell of heavy axle grease, meant to be hidden by the smell of the track, but he knew. She saw it a second later, a dark, wet patch on the inside of the curve, slick and treacherous. The man Murdoch had signaled. Storm Anthem, the doped horse, hit it first. His brain was too slow, his legs too numb to react. His forelegs went out from under him. He didn't fall. Not completely, but he stumbled, breaking his stride, his jockey fighting to keep him upright. He was out of the race. But Lark was ready. The moment she felt Jack's breath hitch, she acted. She didn't pull back. That would have been fatal. She shifted her weight, a tiny, instinctive movement, and put a hard, sudden pressure on the right rein, pulling Jack's head away from the slick, forcing him to take the turn wide, losing ground but keeping his feet. They skidded. Jack's hindquarters fish-tailed, spraying dirt, his hooves searching for purchase on the loose outer track. For one heart-stopping second, he was sideways. Lark leaned into the skid, her body one with his. "Run!" she screamed, her voice lost in the wind. "Run like the night we escaped!" He found his footing. He surged forward, rocketing out of the turn. He was in 2nd place, 1 horse ahead of him. The final stretch. The crowd was a blur. The finish line, a painted white post. was 100 yards away. The lead horse, a big bay, was a full length ahead. "We are not done," Lark whispered, her voice raw. She leaned forward until her chest was flat against his neck. "Now? Jack, for all of it. Now?" She hadn't used a whip. She didn't need to. He gave her everything. The ground thundered. The bay's jockey looked back, his eyes wide with shock. He used his whip. Once. Twice. It didn't matter. Comet Jack, the real horse, the legend, passed him as if he were tied to a post. They crossed the finish line. There was a half-second of absolute, stunned silence. The entire town of Brimstone Creek held its breath. Then, the world exploded. The roar from the crowd was not a cheer. It was a detonation. They had seen a miracle. They had seen the impossible. They had seen the 50-1 long shot win. But Lark didn't stop. She didn't ride to the winner's circle. She slowed Comet Jack, turning him, and rode him straight back to the judges' stand, where Murdoch, Fitch, and Nell were frozen, their faces pale with disbelief. Lark pulled the horse to a halt. He was lathered, trembling, magnificent. She raised her right hand. In it, she held the bridle, holding up the locking brass buckle for all to see. "This is my horse," she shouted, her voice ringing with clarity. "Marked with my own hand." "That's the signal. Theo," Coulter yelled. Theo Pike grabbed the heavy mallet he'd hidden by the wagon and swung it. He struck the massive bronze bell Coulter had brought from the ranch. The deep boom cut through the cheers. A sound of alarm, a summons. "And this is their lie," Coulter roared. He grabbed the canvas on the wagon and ripped it away. It was a stage. Laid out for everyone to see was the evidence. The real High Plains stud book, the fake copper seal from Driscoll's office, and, nailed to a board, the grotesque, glued-on patch of fake scar they'd cut from the fake horse. The crowd, drawn by the bell, surged from the stands, pouring onto the track. They surrounded the wagon, their cheers turning to confused, angry mutters. "What is this? A fake scar. They cheated us." Barlow Fitch found his voice. "This is an outrage slander." Ivory Nell, always the pragmatist, saw the mood turning. "He's a lunatic," she shouted to the crowd, her voice like honeyed steel. "He lost the bet, everyone. To the saloon. The drinks are free, all of them." It was a smart move. Half the crowd hesitated, torn between free whiskey and a good fight. But Fitch wasn't done. He pointed a long, pale finger at Coulter. "This man is a known thief. He stole that horse. He'll be arrested. I'll sue him for every—" "That won't be necessary, Mr. Fitch." A new voice, thin but piercing, cut through the din. Evan Driscoll, the scrivener, his spectacles crooked, his face ashen with terror, pushed through the crowd. He was holding a piece of paper. "You like paper, Mr. Fitch." Driscoll's voice shook, but he held the document high. "This is an old warrant, a federal warrant for cattle rustling and fraud, from the Salt Lake District Court. It seems you left town before they could serve it." Fitch froze. His mask of control finally, terrifyingly, cracked. Sheriff Murdoch saw the game was over. His power, his authority, was evaporating. He did the only thing a cornered animal knows to do. He went for his gun. He ripped the Colt from its holster and fired. Not at Coulter, not at Lark. He fired into the air. 1, 2, 3 shots. "Disperse," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "Get back. This is official business. I am the law. Disperse. I say." It was the worst thing he could have done. The gunshot didn't scatter the crowd. It galvanized them. The sound of the law turning a gun on the people it was meant to protect, all to cover a lie, snapped the last thread of their fear. The muttering turned into a roar. It was a different sound now. It was the sound of a mob that had just found its courage. They didn't move back. They surged forward. "Liar, cheat. Give us our money." Murdoch looked at the wall of angry faces. He looked at Fitch, who was,
For the first time, trapped, he looked at Coulter and Lark, who sat on their white stallion, silent, watching his world crumble. The sheriff's order was broken. His reign was over, and the trial of Brimstone Creek had just begun. The victory at the Derby was a high, thin note, sharp as a bugle call. But the ride back to Ash Willow was silent, heavy with the knowledge that the war was not won. It had only been declared. They'd spent the day in a state of armed siege. Coulter, Lark, and Theo had taken turns on the ridge with the rifle, watching the road from Brimstone Creek, but nothing moved. The town, it seemed, was holding its breath, waiting. Fitch and Murdoch had vanished after the debacle at the track, swallowed by the angry mob. Night fell, not with peace, but with a smothering, absolute darkness. The moon was a prisoner behind a bank of thick clouds. Coulter took the first watch. Lark had insisted on tending the horses, her new tack room now a fortress, the evidence box tucked securely in the root cellar beneath the cabin. Theo, exhausted, had turned in. It was Coulter who smelled it first. It was past 2 a.m, the dead hour. He was pacing the porch when the wind shifted. It brought a smell that didn't belong on the mesa. Not the clean scent of pine or the alkaline smell of dust. It was the sharp, greasy smell of kerosene. He was moving before his brain had fully formed the thought. He grabbed his rifle. "Lark," he bellowed, his voice a raw crack in the silence. "Get out!" He rounded the corner of the cabin, and the world turned red. The grain store, the 50-foot structure that held their entire winter feed, was a torch. Flames were already licking the sky, a hungry, roaring orange that beat back the night, and the fire was spreading. Sparks like angry hornets landing on the dry shingle roof of the main barn. Fitch's boys. Coulter snarled. This wasn't a fight. It was an execution. They'd come to wipe Ash Willow off the map, to destroy the ranch, the horses, all of it. The heat was a physical blow. He saw 3 men on horseback, shadows against the blaze, watching their work. They saw him and fired, the bullets thudding into the cabin wall. Coulter fired back, the rifle kicking hard against his shoulder. One of the shadows cursed, and the 3 riders wheeled, galloping back toward the pass. They had done their job. "Theo!" Coulter yelled, his heart seizing. The main barn was catching now, smoke pouring from the eaves. Theo slept in the bunkhouse, the small room attached to the barn, right where the fire was thickest. "Coulter!" Lark's voice, sharp with panic, came from behind him. "The horses! Get them!" he roared. "Get them to the ditch. I'll get Theo." He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. He sprinted toward the bunkhouse door, the heat searing his face. Lark didn't hesitate. She didn't run for the main barn doors, which were already blocked by a curtain of flame. She ran to the far side, to the low pasture gate that opened onto the deep, dry irrigation ditch that cut behind the property. She ripped the bar loose, her hands raw. The horses were screaming inside, a high, terrifying sound. She plunged into the smoke-filled barn, her eyes streaming. "Hiya, get out!" She grabbed a coiled rope, slapping the rumps of the 2 mares. They bolted, frantic, seeing the opening and plunging into the darkness of the ditch. Silas, the steady roan, followed. Only Comet Jack remained. He was in his stall, rearing, his eyes white with terror, striking the wooden walls. The smoke was thick, acrid. "Jack!" she screamed, choking. "Come on, trust me!" She lunged, grabbed his halter. The fire was on the roof now, sparks raining down. He pulled back, fighting her. "Jack, please!" she sobbed, pulling with all her weight. I can't do this without you." He stopped, his great head lowering, his nostrils flaring. He trusted the voice. He followed her, a white ghost in the smoke, leaping over a burning beam and into the safety of the ditch. At the same moment, Coulter hit the bunkhouse door with his shoulder. It was locked. Theo! A weak cough came from inside. Coulter didn't pause. He stepped back and fired his rifle. Shattering the lock, he kicked the door open. The room was an oven, thick with black, choking smoke. Theo was on the floor, tangled in his blanket, gasping. "Got you," Coulter grunted, hauling the old man over his shoulder. He grabbed a heavy horse blanket from a peg. It was already hot to the touch. He stumbled to the water trough by the door, dunking the blanket, the water hissing as it hit the smoldering fabric. He threw it over both of them and plunged into the yard. They fell to the dirt, gasping. The roof of the main barn groaned, a deep, terrible sound, and then collapsed inward with a sound like a cannon, sending a billion sparks into the sky, a shower of malevolent, shooting stars. Coulter pushed the blanket off, his lungs on fire. He saw Lark, covered in soot, emerge from the ditch. She was alive. The horses were safe. He got to his feet, his mind racing. The fire was taking everything, his life's work. But the evidence. He choked, staggering toward the cabin. The wagon, Driscoll's affidavit. He was going to run back toward the burning wagon where they had displayed the evidence. "Coulter!" Lark shrieked. She ran at him, full tilt, and shoved him, hard. He staggered back, shocked. She grabbed the wet, steaming blanket he had used to save Theo and threw it around his own shoulders. His shirt, he realized, was smoking. "It's just wood," she cried, her voice raw, her hands gripping the front of the blanket, her face inches from his, tears carving clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. "It's just hay. Stop, you're alive. I need you alive." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. "I need you alive, not we. He stopped fighting. The rage, the panic, it all just drained away, leaving a vast, hollow exhaustion. He stared at her, this small, fierce woman who was, once again, saving him from himself. The entire ranch, his past and his future, was a wall of fire behind her, and she was the only thing that was real. Dawn came, gray and sick. The air stank of ash and despair. The grain store was a pile of smoking rubble. The main barn was a skeleton of charred beams. Ash Willow Ranch was gone. Coulter sat on the porch steps of the cabin, the one structure the fire hadn't taken. He was slumped, his head in his hands, his shoulders burned, his spirit broken. He had won the battle, only to lose the war. Fitch had won. He'd lost it all. He heard a step. Lark stood in front of him. She was holding the small, heavy wooden box he kept under his cot. "They burned the wagon," he whispered, his voice dead. "Driscoll's confession, the seal, it's all ash." "No," Lark said. Her voice was quiet, thick with soot, but firm. She knelt in the ash-covered yard in front of him. She opened the lid of the box. Inside, safe and untouched, lay the forged copper seal. Beside it, Evan Driscoll's affidavit, neatly folded, and on top of that, gleaming in the bleak morning light, was the special locking bridle, the brass buckle and its tiny, etched pin resting on the dark leather. Coulter just stared. "I moved it," she said simply. "After we got back from the Derby. I didn't trust the wagon. I didn't trust anything." She looked up at him. "I put it in the root cellar last night, before all this." He looked from the box to her face, her foresight, her strength. She hadn't just been a rider. She had been the general. She had anticipated their last, desperate move. He reached out, his hand shaking, not with fear, but with a profound, bone-deep weariness. He didn't touch the box. He touched her hand, her small, soot-covered fingers laced with his. He squeezed. She squeezed back. A silent promise. They sat there for a long time, hand in hand on the ruined porch, two survivors watching the smoke rise from the bones of their home. Later, inside the cabin, the air was still and warm. The pot-bellied stove was lit, a small, defiant fire against the destruction outside.
The cabin felt like the last safe place on Earth. Coulter pulled off his smoldering, wet shirt. He hissed as the air hit his skin. A large, angry burn blistered his left shoulder, where an ember had landed and stayed. "Sit," Lark said. Her voice was soft, but it held the same authority she used on a frightened horse. He sat on the edge of his cot. She went to her small pack and pulled out a clean rag and a tin of salve. She knelt in front of him, dipping the rag in the water bucket to clean the wound. Her touch was feather-light. She dabbed at the ash, her brow furrowed in concentration, and he saw that her hand was trembling, not from fear, from the reaction, from the simple, overwhelming act of touching him. As she spread the cool salve on the angry red skin, her trembling fingers brushed his collarbone. He reached up, covering her small, soot-stained hand with his own. She froze. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, her lips parted. The air in the cabin became thick, charged with all the words they hadn't said, all the terror they had just shared. He didn't pull her hand away. He held it, his thumb gently rubbing the grime from her knuckles. Then, slowly, he guided her hand from his shoulder to the center of his chest, pressing her palm flat against his skin, right over his heart. He held it there, letting her feel the steady, strong beat. Thump, 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 thump. The proof. He was alive, and she was the reason. Her gaze was locked on his, and the exhaustion, the fear, it all melted away, replaced by a raw, unguarded need. He leaned in, slowly, giving her time to pull back. She didn't move. She didn't even breathe. He closed the distance, his lips touching hers. It was not a kiss of passion, not the frantic claiming he'd imagined in his darkest, loneliest nights. It was a kiss of profound, desperate gratitude. It was soft, and it was deep, and it was gentle. It tasted of ash and salt and the promise of survival. It was a kiss that said, "You are here, you are real, you are safe." He pulled back, just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. Her eyes were closed. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice rough. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a demand. It was a plea, torn from a place he thought had died 3 years ago at Juniper Wash. He wasn't just asking her to stay the night. He was asking her to stay. She didn't answer with words. She just wrapped her arms around his neck, her small, strong body pressing against his, and kissed him back. He lifted her, his one good arm strong around her waist. The camera of the mind did not follow. It lingered on the empty chair, on the warm, orange glow of the stove, on the soft ticking of the fire as it consumed the wood, and on the quiet, final click of a bedroom door closing, shutting out the ruined world and starting a new one. The next morning, the sun rose on a field of black. Coulter stood on the porch, a fresh cup of coffee in his hand. The burn on his shoulder throbbed. He was shirtless, a bandage, clumsily applied by him, covering the wound. The cabin door opened. Lark emerged, wrapped in his blanket. She didn't look shy. She didn't look ashamed. She just looked steady. She took the cup from his hand and took a sip, her eyes clear and resolute, meeting his over the rim. There was a new, quiet peace between them, an understanding that had been forged in fire and sealed in the dark. A sound made Coulter's hand drop to his pistol. A wagon, coming up the pass. He stepped in front of Lark. A second wagon appeared, then a third. It wasn't Fitch. It was a caravan. The first wagon was driven by the rancher who lived on the neighboring mesa, a man Coulter hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Behind him was Evan Driscoll, the scrivener, and behind him, sitting proudly on a buckboard, was Martha Quayle. The wagons were loaded, with fresh-cut lumber, with sacks of grain, with tools. The lead rancher pulled his team to a halt. He spat tobacco into the ash. "Heard you had some trouble." "Vale," he said, his eyes scanning the devastation.
Fitch's brand of justice, it ain't ours. What you and the girl did at the Derby, that was for all of us." He gestured to the lumber. This is for the town's justice. Fitch thought he could burn you out. He didn't realize he was just lighting a fire under the rest of us." Men started unloading. They set to work, pulling down the charred beams, clearing the rubble. They had come to rebuild. Hours later, a new frame was going up. Lark, back in her canvas trousers, was on the low, half-built roof of the new storehouse. A hammer was in her hand, and she swung it with a steady, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack. She was not a refugee. She was not a victim. She was a builder. Coulter stood by the porch, just watching her. He watched the men his neighbors working. He watched the woman who had saved his ranch, his life, and his soul. Theo limped over, holding a saw. "Lot of work to do, boss." Coulter didn't take his eyes off Lark, her silhouette sharp against the blue sky. A slow, rusty smile touched his lips. "I know, Theo," he said, his voice quiet. "A man alone, he's just not enough. He's just a target." He looked at the smoking ruins, and then at the new beams. "But us, we," he looked back at Lark on the roof. "We're home." The Hall of Oxen wasn't a courthouse. It was a glorified auction barn. A huge, drafty building in Brimstone Creek that smelled of sawdust, livestock, and unwashed bodies. It was the only place large enough to hold the entire town, which had descended with a single, furious purpose. The fire at Ash Willow had been the spark. The town's fear of Fitch and Murdoch had finally been burned away, replaced by a cold, communal rage. They had come for justice, and they had found a judge. Judge Ada LaRue was a force of nature. She was a traveling circuit judge, a woman in her late 50s with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that looked as if they'd seen everything and been impressed by nothing. She had ridden into town for a standard land dispute, only to find the sheriff under impromptu house arrest by his own citizenry and the entire populace demanding a trial. She'd convened this hearing in the Hall of Oxen, a massive, scarred auction block serving as her bench. It was irregular. It was probably illegal. But Ada LaRue understood that the law, out here, was often just a thin layer of ice over a boiling pot. Sometimes, you had to let the steam out before the ice would hold. "I will have order," she'd boomed, her voice cutting through the din. "This is not a lynching. This is a hearing. We will proceed with facts." Barlow Fitch, Ivory Nell, and a pale, sweating Sheriff Murdoch stood before her, not in chains, but surrounded by a solid ring of ranchers and miners who had tacitly and silently taken on the role of guards. Coulter and Lark stood on the other side. Behind them stood Evan Driscoll, Martha Quayle, and Theo Pike. "Mr. Driscoll," Judge LaRue said, her gaze sharp. "You claim to have proof of forgery. Present it." Evan Driscoll, who had been a trembling leaf in the saloon attic, now seemed to draw strength from the public eye. He stepped forward, his voice reedy but clear. "Your Honor, this," he held up the bill of sale from Murdoch's impound, "is the document given to Mr. Vale, and this," he held up a certified letter from his own office, "is an official document from the High Plains Breeders Association, bearing their true seal." He laid them on the auction block. "If you look, Your Honor, the seal on the sheriff's document is imprecise. The lettering is thick. It was made from a sand-cast copper mold. A fake." "And how would you know, Mr. Driscoll?" Fitch's voice was a dry sneer. "Because, Mr. Fitch," Driscoll said, pushing his spectacles up, "I am the one who made the fake mold, on your orders. You told me it was for a commemorative plaque. You paid me $30 for it." A gasp went through the crowd. Fitch's mask didn't slip, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. "Next," Judge LaRue said, "Mrs. Quayle." Martha Quayle stepped up, her back straight. I was the registrar for the Derby for 21 years. I registered Comet Jack as a foal. I saw him with my own eyes. He had a mark, a small scar, left flank, shaped like a flicker of flame. A common mark, perhaps. Fitch offered. As common as a two-headed calf, Martha snapped. It was his identifier, the horse they ran as storm anthem at the Derby. She pointed at the fake, which was tied to a post outside. Has a patch of hide glued to his flank. It's an insult to the horse, and to this town. Circumstantial, Fitch said. This, Lark's voice cut through, is not. She stepped forward, holding the custom-made locking bridle. She held up the etched pin. This is my mark. My father was a farrier. He taught me to work leather and metal. I made this. This bridle was on Comet Jack when he won. It is on him now. It cannot be removed without this pin, or by cutting the leather. It proves ownership. It proves my ownership. She didn't stop. She pointed to Comet Jack's hooves. And this, I applied a chemical powder, a recipe from my father, to his hooves before the race. It turns blue when it mixes with the lye in this town's soil. It's a mark they didn't know about. It proves this is the same horse I brought from Ash Willow. Judge LaRue nodded, impressed. Sheriff Murdoch, you have heard the testimony. You are accused of conspiracy to defraud, of forgery, and of leveraging your office for criminal gain. How do you respond? Murdoch, his face mottled red, tore his hat from his head. Your Honor, there was a situation, a breakdown of order. I did what I had to do to keep the peace. These men, my deputies, he gestured wildly. They must have overstepped. I had no knowledge of this storm anthem horse. I was misled. Liar, a voice yelled from the crowd. He was misled. All right, Ivory Nell's smooth voice interjected. She stepped forward, a vision of pale, fragile innocence. She was wearing a fine silk dress, her hands demurely folded. As was I am just a saloon keeper. Your Honor, I run a business. I take bets. I had no idea, mister. Fitch's investments were irregular. I am as much a victim as anyone. Barlow Fitch finally spoke, his voice booming with indignation. This is a farce. I am a legitimate investor. I made a legal offer to buy Mr. Vale's ranch, which he refused. I invested in a string of racehorses. If one of my associates cut corners, if a horse was misidentified, that is a civil matter. A mistake, not a crime. You have no right to hold me. The room was silent. Fitch's defense was strong. It was paper against paper, word against word. Lark stepped forward. She was holding the small, strange device, the tin can, the wire, and the stethoscope earpieces. Ivory Nell, Lark said, her voice clear. You say you're just a saloon keeper, that you had no knowledge. Nell smiled, a small, condescending tilt of her lips. None at all, dear. Then, Lark said, you won't mind if Mr. Driscoll reads the affidavit he signed, based on the conversation he personally overheard from the attic above your office. Ivory Nell's smile froze. Driscoll stepped up, his voice shaking but loud. I, Evan Driscoll, do swear that on the night of the 19th, I did overhear Barlow Fitch, Sheriff Murdoch, and Miss Ivory Nell plan to run the fake horse at the Derby. I heard Miss Nell confirm she had collected all the bets. I heard Mr. Fitch order that Miss Lark Monroe was to be dealt with permanent. A woman in the crowd screamed. Ivory Nell went as white as her lace gloves. And Mr. Fitch, Theo Pike's gruff voice cut in. He limped forward, holding a worn, leather-bound ledger. You say you're a legal investor. Is that right? That is correct. Fitch spat. Then you won't mind explaining this, Theo said, opening the book. This is your private ledger, from the Silver Chute gambling den, the one you lost in a card game to me 5 years ago. I kept it. Always knew it'd be valuable. Theo ran a gnarled finger down a page. It lists Murdoch, 10%, Nell, 5%,
And a list of names. He began to read. Abel Steiner, 1 mare seized for debt. Josiah Kent, wagon, seized for taxes. Elias Cole, 40 acres, seized for unpaid water rights. At every name, a man in the crowd flinched, or swore, or looked at his neighbor. These were not just names. They were the small ranchers, the farmers, the miners. They were the men who had been slowly, legally, bled dry by Murdoch's seizures and Fitch's investments. He took my prize bull, yelled a man in overalls. He seized my pa's watch, another cried. They took my claim. The room was exploding. The ice had cracked. The anger of the people, held back for so long, was a flood. They were surging forward, their faces dark with rage. Judge LaRue slammed her gavel. Order, order. She stood, her face a mask of cold fury. She pointed a finger at Murdoch. Sheriff Murdoch, you are a disgrace to the badge and a cancer on this territory. I find you in contempt of this hearing and place you under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and dereliction of duty. She turned to Fitch and Nell. I am issuing warrants for the arrest of Mr. Barlow Fitch and Miss Ivory Nell. Pending a full federal trial, their assets are to be frozen. She pointed to the ranchers who had been guarding them. You men secure the prisoners. Murdoch crumpled, putting his hands out as if to be cuffed. Ivory Nell looked, for 1 second, as if she might faint. But Barlow Fitch did not move. He smiled, a thin, cold, reptilian smile. An admirable performance. Judge, he rasped. But you seem to forget where you are. I am the law here. The law is who has the money, and who has the gun. It happened faster than a snake bite. A deputy, still loyal to Fitch's money, had been standing near the wall. He'd been ignored. He drew his pistol and tossed it, underhand, to Fitch. Fitch caught it in one fluid motion. He didn't aim at Coulter. He didn't aim at Lark. He aimed at the one person who could make it all legal. He aimed at Judge Ada LaRue. No, Coulter yelled. He moved, not as a fighter, but as a shield. He threw himself in front of the judge, his body covering hers. Just as Fitch fired, the gun roared in the enclosed space. The sound was deafening. Coulter grunted, a sharp, punched-out sound, as the bullet tore through the flesh of his left arm. It was a graze, hot as a branding iron, but he held his ground, shoving the judge behind the heavy auction block. Fitch raised the pistol again to finish the job. But he never fired. Lark had moved. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't run. The moment the gun was tossed, she'd grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, the solid brass custom-locking buckle of her bridle, which she still held in her hand. Fitch was focused on Coulter. He didn't see her coming from the side. She didn't hit him. She swung the heavy brass buckle, not at his head, but at his wrist. It was a farrier's move, a blacksmith's move, a sharp, precise, bone-jarring strike, aimed at the joint, the same way one would strike a pin from a horseshoe. Fitch screamed, a high, thin sound. As his wrist bones cracked, the gun clattered to the floor. Lark didn't stop. She scooped up the pistol. She didn't point it. In one practiced, lightning-fast motion, she flipped it, broke the action, and dumped the live rounds onto the floor. Click, clack, clack, clack. They rolled like scattered brass teeth. She threw the empty, useless gun onto the desk in front of the judge. The entire hall was frozen. They had just seen a rancher take a bullet for the law, and a stable girl disarm the most dangerous man in the territory without firing a shot. Fitch was on his knees, clutching his broken wrist, his face a mask of agonizing disbelief. Murdoch, who had been gaping, suddenly felt the cold, hard steel of handcuffs on his own wrists. Theo Pike was cinching them tight. Ivory Nell stood alone. Her facade was shattered. The powder on her face was stark against her pale, clammy skin. She slowly, methodically, began to pull off her white lace gloves, finger by finger. Her hands, when they were revealed, were trembling, Not with fear, with rage. The queen had been toppled. The shouting in the Hall of Oxen died. The dust, kicked up by the scuffle, began to settle. A single shaft of late afternoon sunlight broke through a high, dirty window, cutting through the gloom. It illuminated the auction block, the scattered bullets, and the faces of Coulter and Lark, who were standing, side by side, breathing hard. The dust mote spun in the golden light, like tiny, hopeful stars. A new, fragile quiet settled over Brimstone Creek. A beginning. The fire had taken the old, dry wood, but it had left the stone foundations, and on those foundations, the people of Brimstone Creek had built. The sun was setting, painting Raven Mesa in hues of apricot and deep purple. It was only a few days after the hearing, but Ash Willow Ranch was already being reborn. The new hay barn, built with lumber from half a dozen different ranches, was framed and partially roofed, and the cabin's porch, which had been scorched, was rebuilt, wider and stronger than before. It was full. The people who had come to rebuild had stayed for supper. It was a celebration, not of a victory, but of a truce with the land, with each other, and with the future. Theo Pike sat on the steps, his back straight, finally tapping his boot to a tune. One of the ranchers, a man Coulter had once called a stranger, was playing a harmonica. It was a slow, simple waltz, a melody that was more heart than music. Lark stood by the new corral, her arms resting on the top rail. The horses, Comet Jack, Silas, the two mares were eating quietly, their coats gleaming in the dusk. They were safe. The air was calm. Coulter watched her from the porch. He was wearing a clean shirt. His left arm, where the bullet had grazed him, was in a neat sling, also provided by Martha Quayle. He'd spent the last 3 years building walls. He'd watched, stunned, as his neighbors tore them down and built him a home instead. He stepped off the porch. The music continued, a soft, hopeful rhythm on the cooling air. He walked across the yard. The ground was not yet grass, just packed, dark earth, scuffed by the boots of his friends. He stopped in front of Lark. She turned, a small, tired smile on her face. He didn't say anything. He just held out his right hand, palm up. Lark looked at his hand. It was the same hand that had pulled her from the straw, the hand that had chafed hers by the stove, the hand that had covered hers on the horse's mane. She hesitated. She didn't know this move. This wasn't riding. This wasn't fighting. I don't know how, she whispered, her gaze flickering to the people on the porch. Neither do I, Coulter said, his voice a low rasp. I figure we'll find the rhythm, like you said. She placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, solid. He put his bandaged left arm awkwardly around her waist. She rested her free hand on his good shoulder, and they danced. It was a clumsy, shuffling thing at first. They stepped on each other's toes. He was stiff, unused to this kind of closeness. She was too light, ready to spring away at any sudden movement. The harmonica player smiled, but kept playing, the beat steady as a heartbeat. Coulter pulled her a fraction closer. Just stop fighting, he murmured. Stop looking for the escape route. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She relaxed, just a bit, and let him lead. Their feet found the beat. It was no longer a dance, but a sway. Two tired, scarred people, holding each other up, moving as one to a simple tune. They moved across the dark earth, their shadows long in the twilight. A silent, public acknowledgement that the space between them was, at last, closed. When the song ended, they didn't immediately step apart. Lark rested her head against his chest for just a second, listening to his heart. She looked over at the new, strong corral, at the horses, their shapes dark and peaceful. From now on, she said, her voice quiet but full of a new, hard certainty. We breed them clean. We use Jack's line, but we don't hoard it. Coulter looked down at her, listening. We start a school,
she said, her idea taking shape as she spoke it. Just a small one. We teach the other ranchers, the ones who came to help. We teach them how to read a bloodline, how to spot a fake, how to train with a soft hand, not a rope. We give them back what Fitch and Murdoch tried to steal. We make this whole territory too smart to be cheated again. Coulter stared at her. She wasn't just talking about a ranch. She was talking about a legacy. A shared one. He let go of her, but kept her hand. Wait here. He went into the cabin. The porch went quiet, the harmonica stopping. Lark stood alone in the yard, suddenly exposed. Coulter came back out. He was holding a small, dark wooden box. It was old, the corners worn smooth. It was not the box that had held the evidence. It was his. He stopped in front of her. He opened the lid. Inside, on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single silver bracelet. It was simple, heavy, and tarnished, but beautiful. It was etched with a delicate, flowing pattern, the thin, weeping branches of a willow tree. It was my mother's, Coulter said, his voice thick. He took it from the box. She gave it to Alara. And Alara? He stopped, his throat closing. He cleared it. It's been in this box for 3 years. Lark's heart was pounding. She knew what this was. Coulter, you don't... Just listen, he said, cutting her off, his voice urgent, his eyes holding hers. He took her left hand, the one with the faded rope burns on the wrist. This ain't a ring, Lark. It's not a chain. It's not a brand. I'm not locking you in. He slid the cool, heavy silver over her hand. It settled on her wrist, fitting as if it had been made for her. The willow branches seemed to wrap around the scars, covering them. It's a promise, he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. It's a promise that I'm going to choose you. Every day, I'm going to wake up and choose you. Just like I did in that barn, just like I did at the Derby. This, he tapped the silver, just means I'm not letting go. Lark's eyes filled with tears. She didn't wipe them away. She looked at the bracelet, at the man in front of her, the man who had been a ghost, and she saw him, whole, for the first time. She raised her free hand, not to her face, but to his. She cupped his jaw, her thumb brushing the rough stubble. I choose you back, Coulter Vale, she whispered. He leaned down, and she rose up. They met in a kiss that was nothing like the desperate, grateful kiss after the fire. This kiss was slow. It was warm. It was a vow. It held the taste of coffee and wood smoke and a future they were, at last, looking at together. A cheer went up from the porch. Theo Pike clapped Coulter on his good shoulder. Martha Quayle was openly weeping. Well, Lark said, her voice breathless, a bright, clear smile finally reaching her eyes. If we're going to build a legacy, we need a name for the bloodline. Comet Jack's line, Coulter said. And Ash Willow's, she countered. She looked at the charred beams of the old barn, and then at the new, clean wood. Ash and Comet, the Ash Comet line. The Ash Comet line. Coulter tested the words. He smiled. I like the sound of that. This ranch sure is a damn sight less lonely than it used to be. Boss. Theo Pike cackled, lighting his pipe. The next day, the ranchers who had helped rebuild presented them with a gift. It was a new sign for the gate, carved from a single, thick plank of pine. The lettering was deep and clear. It read, "Not for sale." Underneath, in smaller letters, they had added, "The home of what can't be traded." They hung it on the new gate. It was a statement to the world. That evening, when the others were gone, Coulter took his pocket knife. He stood at the gate for a long time, looking at the words. Then, at the very bottom, in small, careful letters, he carved a final line. Found in a barn, kept by a heart. Later that night, the wind picked up, but it was just a wind. It didn't howl with loneliness, it just blew
In the small, warm room in the back of the barn, Lark was rebandaging Coulter's arm. The bullet graze was healing, the skin pink and clean. The small room smelled of hay and horse and the salve she was applying. A single lantern cast a warm, golden glow. She finished tying the knot, her touch gentle. "It's healing clean," she said. He didn't move. He just watched her face in the lantern light. He reached out with his good hand. Not to hold her, but just to touch her face. He traced the line of her jaw. "You're safe here," he said. It was a statement of fact. Lark leaned into his touch. She took his good hand, the right one, and placed it on her own chest, over her heart. Then she leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, just as she had on the mesa in the moonlight. She closed her eyes, just listening to the sound of his breathing, the steady beat of his heart under her hand, the sound of the horses shuffling peacefully in the next stall. This was the end of the running. This was the end of the fear. "Home," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "Home it's just the place you can finally breathe easy." She felt his arm, the one she had just bandaged, come around her, holding her close. The door to the tack room, the one he had built for her, swung shut on its new hinges, closing them in with the warmth and the quiet. Peace at Ash Willow Ranch had become a tangible thing. It was the smell of fresh-cut pine from the new barn, the sound of Lark's low humming as she brushed down the mares, the shared silence on the porch as the sun went down. For 5 days, the world had been still. Fitch was gone. Murdoch was in a federal cell. The town was healing. But Barlow Fitch had not been captured. He had melted into the Badlands. A snake slithering under a rock, and a snake, Coulter knew, always waits. The 6th morning began before the sun. A fog, thick and cold as a shroud, rolled up from the creek bed, swallowing the ranch in a world of silent, blind white. Coulter stood on the new porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, his bandaged arm in a sling. He was listening. The silence was too deep. Lark came to stand beside him, wrapped in his blanket. She didn't look at the fog. She was listening, too. "I don't like this," Coulter said, his voice a low rumble. "Me neither," she whispered. Then they heard it. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a sound that should have been comforting hoofbeats. A lot of them, moving fast. Coulter's hand went to the pistol on his hip. "They're trying to stampede the horses." Lark held up a hand, her head cocked, her eyes closed. "Wait." The hoofbeats grew closer, a muffled, ghostly thunder in the fog. They're wrong," she whispered, her voice sharp. "Wrong." "Listen." She pointed into the white void. "The rhythm. It's off. One horse the nails are loose on the right foreshoe. It's a dragging step. And another the gait is short. It's a foundered pony." She opened her eyes, and they were wide with a terrible clarity. "It's not a posse. Coulter, it's not the army. It's a ragtag bunch. They're riding stolen, broken-down horses." She looked at him. "It's Barlow. He's desperate. He's come back for Jack." As if summoned by his name, a hoarse voice bellowed from the fog, not 50 yards away. "Vale, you think a woman judge can save you? You think these fences will hold? I'm taking what's mine, starting with that white devil." A shot cracked the air, wild, the bullet singing high over the cabin. "Theo," Coulter yelled. "To the ridge, keep them pinned if you can." The old man, rifle in hand, was already melting into the rocks above the pass, a seasoned ghost. "They're trying to surround the barn," Lark said, her mind working, fast. "They want to set another fire, smoke us out, grab the horses in the panic." "They're expecting us to hide," Coulter said, a new, cold fire in his eyes. He was no longer the man from Juniper Wash. He was the man who had stood for the judge. "They've got maybe 3, 4 men," Lark said, still listening. And their horses are tired. Ours are not. A plan, unspoken, formed between them. This was not a siege. This was a hunt, and they were not the prey.
We don't hide, Coulter said. We drive. We use the herd.
The V formation, Lark said, nodding, her mind already there. They're coming from the south. We break out the north gate. We use the herd's own reflex. They'll follow the lead.
I'll be the lead, Coulter said. He ripped his arm from the sling, the healing wound screaming in protest. He ignored it. I'll ride Jack. He's what Fitch wants. I'll draw him.
And I'll be the shepherd, Lark said, already running for the barn. I'll ride Silas. I'll keep the mares on your flank. They'll think it's a panic. They won't realize it's an attack until we're through them.
They moved with the silent efficiency of a cougar pair. In the fog-filled barn, Lark bridled the horses. She threw Coulter's saddle on Comet Jack. He mounted, his face pale with pain, but his jaw set. Lark vaulted onto Silas bareback. Open the north gate, Coulter bellowed. Now, Lark, drive them. Lark let out a high, sharp cry. She swung a rope, slapping the rumps of the two mares. The gate burst open. A solid, 4-horse phalanx exploded from the barn, not in panic, but in a controlled, thundering charge. They burst from the fog almost on top of Barlow and his 3 men. Barlow's men, who had been dismounting to light torches, yelled in shock. They scrambled for their horses.
There he is,
Barlow screamed, seeing the white stallion.
Get him!
But they were in the way. The herd, led by a charging Coulter, slammed into their disorganized line. It was a wave of pure, equine power. One of Barlow's men was knocked from his saddle. Another's horse reared, terrified, and bolted. To the pass, Coulter yelled at Lark. Lead them to Red Bottle Pass. He broke left, a white streak in the mist, giving Fitch the target he wanted. Barlow and his 2 remaining men spurred their tired mounts, following the prize. I've got him, Barlow roared, firing his pistol. Lark, meanwhile, had slowed, turning the 2 mares and Silas, pushing them up the high, hidden game trail, above the pass. The chase was on. Coulter, even with 1 bad arm, was a master horseman. And Comet Jack was a legend. He didn't just run, he consumed the ground. But Coulter wasn't running away. He was leading. He was pulling Fitch into the narrow, treacherous canyon of Red Bottle Pass. This was his land. He plunged into the narrow opening, the canyon walls rising 100 feet on either side. The ground here was not dirt. It was loose shale, gravel that slipped and slid underfoot. Coulter knew every step. He let Jack slow, letting his hooves pick their way. Barlow and his men thundered in after him, their horses shod by a drunken blacksmith, their riders blinded by greed, hit the loose gravel at a run. One of the horses went down, its legs sliding out from under it with a scream, sending its rider crashing into the canyon wall. Now it was just Barlow and 1 other man. They slowed, realizing the trap. They had Coulter. He was at a dead end, the pass blocked by a rock slide from a decade ago. It's over, Vale, Barlow snarled, dismounting, his pistol steady. The horse, now, or you die here, like your wife. Coulter sat on the white stallion, 20 yards away, his chest heaving. He was trapped. You should have taken my money, Vale, Barlow said, walking forward. You should have stayed a coward. Coulter just smiled, a slow, cold smile. He looked up, past Barlow. Now, Lark, he said, his voice quiet. A single, high-pitched whistle cut the air. Barlow spun around. On the ridge above him, a figure stood against the gray sky. Lark. She held a signal flare, one of the ones they'd bought for the Derby. She struck it. With a whoosh, a brilliant red star shot into the sky, exploding, bathing the entire canyon in a bloody, spectral light. It cut through the fog, a beacon of justice. What is that? Barlow's man stammered, his horse prancing in terror. "It's the law, Mr. Fitch!" A new voice boomed, echoing down the canyon. Barlow spun back. At the mouth of the pass, where they had entered, a solid line of men and women on horseback had appeared, blocking the only exit. It was Judge Ada LaRue, astride a tall bay, a federal warrant in her hand. Beside her was Evan Driscoll, holding a shotgun, his face pale but resolute, and Martha Quayle, holding a lantern. And behind them, a dozen ranchers from Brimstone Creek, their rifles resting on their saddles. Theo Pike was on the ridge opposite Lark, his own rifle trained on Barlow's chest. They were surrounded. The pass, Fitch's intended smuggling route, his escape, had become his cage. Barlow looked at the judge. He looked at Coulter. He looked at the ranchers. His face, the face of a master manipulator, crumpled. The arrogance, the power, it all just fled. He was just a man, in a trap, out of time. His last man threw his gun on the gravel. "I'm done. I ain't dying for this." Barlow looked at his own pistol. He looked at Coulter, his eyes black with a final, desperate hatred. "Don't try it, son," Theo's voice echoed from the rocks. Barlow's hand went slack. The pistol dropped from his fingers, clattering on the shale. It was over. The trial of Ivory Nell was short, faced with Barlow's capture and the full, undeniable weight of the town's testimony. She did what she had always done. She survived. In Judge LaRue's temporary office, she laid a second, hidden ledger on the desk. "Mr. Fitch was a partner. Judge," she'd said, her voice smooth as silk. "But I have other partners, men in St. Louis, men in Washington, men who would be very interested to know that their investments are secure. And I'm sure you would be very interested in their names." She traded her kingdom for her freedom. The charges of conspiracy in Brimstone Creek were dropped, in exchange for her testimony against the entire corrupt enterprise. From the territory to the capital, Ivory Nell, stripped of her saloon, but not her life, left town on the noon stage. A woman broken, but not defeated. The reign of corruption was, at last, truly over. The next dawn, the sun broke over Raven Mesa, clear and bright, burning away the last of the fog. It was a new day, the first day. The air was cold and clean. Lark, wearing Coulter's good shirt, walked to the new barn. The solid pine doors were warm from the morning sun. She pulled the heavy bar back and swung them open. The horses, calm and safe, breathed clouds of white steam into the golden light. She led Comet Jack out, his white coat gleaming. He dropped his head, nudging her shoulder. She didn't lead him to the pasture. She led him to the cabin, where Coulter was standing on the porch, watching her. His arm was back in its sling, but his face was at peace. Lark stopped at the steps, her hand on Jack's mane. She looked at the horse, then at the man. "It's the first day," she said, her voice soft, full of a quiet wonder. "It's the first day we don't have to run." Coulter nodded. He walked off the porch, past her, to the new gate at the entrance to the ranch. He stopped, his hand resting on the new, carved sign. "Not for sale." Lark walked Comet Jack over, coming to stand beside him. Coulter didn't look at the horse. He looked at her. He took her free hand, the one wearing the silver bracelet, and held it. "I came here for a horse," he said, his voice a low, steady rasp. I was just a ghost, looking for something to keep this place alive." He turned, his gaze holding hers, his eyes clear and full of a light she had never seen there. "But I came home for you." He leaned in, and she met him. They kissed, a long, slow kiss of promise, of arrival. The white stallion stood patiently beside them, a silent, magnificent witness. The camera of the mind pulled back, leaving them at the gate, hand in hand. It lingered on the sign, the sun gleaming on the raw, carved wood found in a barn,
kept by a heart. The sound of Theo Pike's laughter, bright on the morning air, mixed with the soft, contented nicker of a horse, and the promise of a love that was, at last, not a fight, but a choice, made every day. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We're a new channel, and we're so glad you're here with us. Please leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. We'd love to share our thoughts and hear yours. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like. And if you can, support us by hitting that hype button. It helps get these stories out to more folks who love the West as much as we do.